Good evening, and welcome to Bedtime Biographies, where together we unwind and drift away to the stories of remarkable lives. Before we begin, if soothing history helps you unwind, please like and subscribe. It makes a big difference in helping other sleepless souls find our channel. Oh, and which remarkable figure would you like us to tackle next? Let us know in the comments below. Tonight, we explore the life of Vladimir Lenin, a revolutionary who reshaped the 20th century. He was the architect of a new Russia, leading a movement that overturned empires and defined an era. But who was Vladimir Lenin before he changed the world? How did his early years shape the man he became, and what drove him from quiet student to revolutionary icon? Together, we'll journey through Lenin's life, from his childhood on the banks of the Volga to secret meetings in St. Petersburg apartments, and finally to the very heart of revolution itself. So just relax and let your mind drift as we explore the remarkable life of Vladimir Lenin. Chapter 1. An Inheritance of Fire. The story begins in 1870, in the provincial town of Simbirsk, perched on the western bank of the Volga River. Picture a place where wooden houses lean into muddy streets, where church bells mark the hours, and where the mighty river flows past with all the patience of eternity. Here, in a modest but respectable home, Ilya Ulyanov paces the floor, waiting for his fourth child to be born. Outside, April snow melts into the black earth of Russia. Inside, Maria Alexandrovna labors to bring new life into a world that seems frozen in time. When the baby finally arrives, a boy, healthy and loud, Ilya permits himself a moment of pure joy before returning to his papers. There's always more work to be done. They name him Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. Nobody in that room, not the exhausted mother, not the proud father, not the midwife washing her hands in the corner, could imagine what this squalling infant would become. How could they? History doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It arrives in the ordinary moments, disguised as everyday life. Ilya Ulyanov was a man caught between worlds. The son of a serf who'd earned his freedom, he'd climbed the ranks of the imperial education system through sheer determination and an almost religious faith in the power of learning. By the time Vladimir was born, Ilya had become an inspector of schools for the entire Simbirsk province, a position that put him firmly in the ranks of the minor nobility. Think about that for a moment. A former serf's son, teaching the empire's children. It was the kind of success story that Alexander II's reforms had promised to make possible. The Tsar Liberator had freed the serfs in 1861, just 9 years before Vladimir's birth. Russia was changing, or at least trying to. But change in Russia has always been a dangerous business. The ground beneath your feet might look solid, but there are always cracks forming, always pressures building beneath the surface. Ilya felt those pressures every day as he traveled from village to village, trying to build schools where none had existed, trying to light candles of literacy in the vast darkness of rural ignorance. The Ulyanov household hummed with a peculiar energy. It was a home of books and debates, of piano lessons and chess games, where German was spoken alongside Russian, where Orthodox traditions mixed with Enlightenment ideas. Maria Alexandrovna, born Maria Blank, brought her own complexity to the family. The daughter of a doctor with German roots, she carried whispers of Jewish ancestry that the family never quite acknowledged out loud. Vladimir grew up in this swirl of identities and aspirations. The third son, with his distinctive features, high cheekbones, slightly slanted eyes, that some attributed to possible Kalmyk ancestry on his father's side, though this is not certain. Russia itself was written on his face, that vast empire where European and Asian bloodlines had been mixing for centuries. The house filled with children, Anna, the eldest, serious and studious. Alexander, Sasha to the family, brilliant and brooding. Vladimir, quick and competitive. Then Olga, Dmitri, and finally little Maria. 6 children climbing over each other, arguing over toys and books while their father worked late into the night, planning new schools for peasant children who'd never held a pencil. Ilya believed in progress the way some men believe in God. He'd seen what education could do. It had lifted him from nothing to something. Every school he opened was a small revolution, a tiny crack in the ancient walls of Russian backwardness. He worked himself to exhaustion, traveling in all weather, battling bureaucracy and local indifference, coming home with muddy boots and stories of villages where children learned their letters by candlelight. But by the late 1870s, the wind was changing. Alexander II, the Tsar who'd freed the serfs, was growing nervous. Revolutionary groups were sprouting like mushrooms after rain. Young people with wild eyes and foreign books talked about overthrowing everything. In March of 1881, when Vladimir was not quite 11, a bomb thrown by revolutionaries finally found its mark. The Tsar Liberator died in a St. Petersburg street, his legs shattered, his reforms dying with him. Alexander III came to the throne with a simple message. Enough. Enough reform. Enough progress. Enough dangerous ideas. The new Tsar believed in orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, the old triple formula of Russian power. Schools that taught peasants to think were suddenly viewed with suspicion. Inspectors like Ilya Ulyanov found their work increasingly difficult, their ideals increasingly dangerous. Vladimir watched his father grow grayer, more tired, more frustrated. The schools Ilya had worked so hard to build were being strangled by new regulations, new restrictions. Progress, it seemed, had been a temporary illusion. The empire was tightening its fist again, squeezing out the spaces where hope had briefly flowered. Yet, in that comfortable house in Simbirsk, with its piano and its books and its 6 bright children, life went on. Vladimir played chess with frightening intensity, demolishing his siblings with a focus that bordered on cruelty. He swam in the Volga during the brief, blazing summers. He absorbed his father's faith in education and his mother's quiet strength. He was preparing for something, though he didn't know what. History was gathering itself in that house by the river, in the tensions between old and new, between hope and reaction, between a father's dreams of gradual progress and the darker currents flowing through the empire. The fuse was being lit, though nobody could see the flame yet, not even the boy who would one day set the world on fire. Chapter 2. The Brother's Ghost. January 1886. Vladimir was 15, home from gymnasium for the winter holidays. The house smelled of beeswax and boiled cabbage. Outside, Simbirsk lay buried under 3 feet of snow. Inside, something was wrong with Sasha. Alexander Ulyanov had always been the quiet one, the brilliant one, the one who could lose himself for hours in a book about earthworms or chemical reactions. Now home from St. Petersburg University, he moved through the house like a sleepwalker. He'd sit at the piano but wouldn't play. He'd pick up his old microscope but wouldn't look through it. Their father, Ilya, was dying. Everyone knew it, but nobody said it. The years of traveling in open sleighs through blizzards, the endless battles with bureaucrats, the crushing disappointment of watching his schools wither under the new Tsar's restrictions, it had hollowed him out. He lay upstairs, breathing raggedly, while Maria Alexandrovna moved between his bedside and the kitchen, her face a mask of competent grief. On January 12th, Ilya Ulyanov died. Vladimir watched his older brother stand by the coffin, saw something harden in Sasha's face. Later, going through papers, they found their father's last report to the Ministry of Education. Even dying, he'd been documenting the state of rural schools, counting desks and textbooks, tallying up the small victories and large defeats of his life's work. Sasha returned to Petersburg changed. His letters home grew shorter, more cryptic. He mentioned new friends, late-night meetings, important work that kept him from his studies. Maria Alexandrovna worried. Vladimir, caught up in his final year at gymnasium, barely noticed. He was busy being brilliant, finishing first in his class, winning the gold medal, dreaming of following his brother to university. March 1st, 1887. A telegram arrived. Vladimir was playing chess with his younger brother Dmitri when their mother's scream shattered the afternoon quiet. Sasha had been arrested. Along with other students, he'd been caught with a bomb, planning to assassinate Alexander III on the 6th anniversary of his father's death. The news spread through Simbirsk like wildfire. The Ulyanovs, that respectable family of educators and civil servants, harbored a terrorist. Neighbors whispered behind curtains. Friends suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. The director of Vladimir's gymnasium, Fyodor Kerensky, called him into his office, not to expel him, but to express bewilderment. How could the son of Ilya Ulyanov, that paragon of gradual reform, turn to violence? The trial was swift and secret. Maria Alexandrovna traveled alone to St. Petersburg. None of her husband's former colleagues would help her. None of their respectable friends would even acknowledge her. She sat in the courtroom and watched her eldest son refuse to beg for mercy. When they asked him to speak in his own defense, Sasha gave a lecture on social justice and historical necessity. He quoted Hegel and Darwin, explaining why the evolution of society required revolutionary action. The prosecutor called him arrogant. The judges called him irredeemable. His mother called him her son and wept. Sasha stood straight-backed in the dock, 20 years old, already seeing past the courtroom to some future where his death would mean something. He'd studied chemistry to understand the natural world. Now he would die to change the social world. They hanged him on May 8th, along with 4 other conspirators, in the courtyard of Schlüsselburg Fortress. The rope was too thick. It took him 20 minutes to die. The authorities sent his personal effects home in a small box. Some books, a photograph of his family, the gold watch his father had given him for graduating gymnasium, and a letter he'd written the night before his execution, telling his mother he regretted only the pain he'd caused her. Vladimir received the news at school. His classmates later remembered how he went completely white, how he walked out of the building without a word. They found him hours later by the Volga, staring at the water. When someone tried to comfort him by saying Sasha was a hero, Vladimir turned and said something strange. "No, we won't go that way. That's not the way." What way, then? In the weeks that followed, Vladimir threw himself into his studies with new ferocity. He memorized Latin texts, solved mathematical equations, wrote essays on Roman law, but his teachers noticed a change. The eager boy who'd once debated enthusiastically in class now sat silent, watching, calculating. When he did speak, his words had an edge that made others uncomfortable. The Ulyanovs became pariahs overnight. Friends crossed the street to avoid them. The authorities watched their house. Vladimir's gold medal couldn't get him into any university. Who would accept the brother of a terrorist? Only Kerensky would write him a recommendation letter, carefully phrased to emphasize the young man's academic brilliance while distancing him from his brother's crimes. That summer, the family fled Simbirsk. They sold the house for whatever they could get, and retreated to Kokushkino, the rural estate of Maria Alexandrovna's family. The main house was white-columned, gracious, a remnant of the old gentry life that was already fading. Vladimir took over a small wing, turning it into his study. He spent the months reading everything in his dead brother's trunk. Chemistry textbooks with margin notes about explosives, political pamphlets denouncing autocracy, works by Pisarev and Dobrolyubov, the radical critics who'd inspired a generation of revolutionaries. And one book in particular that Sasha had underlined heavily, Chernyshevsky's What Is to Be Done. The novel was terrible as literature. Wooden characters, implausible plot, prose like a police report. But Vladimir didn't read it for style. He read it for the vision of new people who rejected traditional morality and built their lives on rational principles. Its protagonist, Rakhmetov, slept on nails to toughen himself for the revolutionary struggle. He ate only food that ordinary workers could afford. He turned himself into an instrument of history. Vladimir began his own transformation that summer. He started each day with cold baths and calisthenics, training his body while his mind absorbed his brother's abandoned library. He played chess against himself, analyzing each game afterward to eliminate weaknesses. He walked for hours through the countryside, always alone, always thinking. His sister Anna watched him with growing concern. The brother she'd known, who'd laughed easily and played practical jokes, was disappearing. In his place stood someone harder, more focused, frighteningly disciplined. When she tried to talk to him about Sasha, he would listen politely, then change the subject to economic statistics or European politics. By autumn, he'd read What Is to Be Done 5 times. Each reading revealed new layers. Chernyshevsky hadn't just written about revolution. He'd provided a manual for creating revolutionaries. Take yourself apart, analyze each component, rebuild yourself for maximum effectiveness. Emotion was inefficient. Sentiment was weakness. The future belonged to those who could think clearly and act decisively. Vladimir Ulyanov was 17 years old, brilliant, angry, and completely alone. His father's dream of gradual progress had died with him. His brother's romantic terrorism had led to the noose. Somewhere between these failures lay another path, but finding it would require becoming someone new, someone harder, someone who could wait, plan, and strike only when victory was certain. The boy who'd grieved by the Volga was gone. What remained was the raw material for Lenin. Chapter 2. The Brother's Ghost. January 1886. Vladimir was 15, home from gymnasium for the winter holidays. The house smelled of beeswax and boiled cabbage. Outside, Simbirsk lay buried under 3 feet of snow. Inside, something was wrong with Sasha. Alexander Ulyanov had always been the quiet one, the brilliant one, the one who could lose himself for hours in a book about earthworms or chemical reactions. Now home from St. Petersburg University, he moved through the house like a sleepwalker. He'd sit at the piano but wouldn't play. He'd pick up his old microscope but wouldn't look through it. Their father, Ilya, was dying. Everyone knew it, but nobody said it. The years of traveling in open sleighs through blizzards, the endless battles with bureaucrats, the crushing disappointment of watching his schools wither under the new Tsar's restrictions, it had hollowed him out. He lay upstairs, breathing raggedly, while Maria Alexandrovna moved between his bedside and the kitchen, her face a mask of competent grief. On January 12th, Ilya Ulyanov died. Vladimir watched his older brother stand by the coffin, saw something harden in Sasha's face. Later, going through papers, they found their father's last report to the Ministry of Education. Even dying, he'd been documenting the state of rural schools, counting desks and textbooks, tallying up the small victories and large defeats of his life's work. Sasha returned to Petersburg changed. His letters home grew shorter, more cryptic. He mentioned new friends, late-night meetings, important work that kept him from his studies. Maria Alexandrovna worried. Vladimir, caught up in his final year at gymnasium, barely noticed. He was busy being brilliant, finishing first in his class, winning the gold medal, dreaming of following his brother to university. March 1st, 1887. A telegram arrived. Vladimir was playing chess with his younger brother Dmitri when their mother's scream shattered the afternoon quiet. Sasha had been arrested. Along with other students, he'd been caught with a bomb, planning to assassinate Alexander III on the 6th anniversary of the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. The news spread through Simbirsk like wildfire. The Ulyanovs, that respectable family of educators and civil servants, harbored a terrorist. Neighbors whispered behind curtains. Friends suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. The director of Vladimir's gymnasium, Fyodor Kerensky, called him into his office, not to expel him, but to express bewilderment. How could the son of Ilya Ulyanov, that paragon of gradual reform, turn to violence? The trial was swift and secret. Maria Alexandrovna traveled alone to St. Petersburg. None of her husband's former colleagues would help her. None of their respectable friends would even acknowledge her. She sat in the courtroom and watched her eldest son refuse to beg for mercy. When they asked him to speak in his own defense, Sasha gave a lecture on social justice and historical necessity. He quoted Hegel and Darwin, explaining why the evolution of society required revolutionary action. The prosecutor called him arrogant. The judges called him irredeemable. His mother called him her son and wept. Sasha stood straight-backed in the dock, 20 years old, already seeing past the courtroom to some future where his death would mean something. He'd studied chemistry to understand the natural world. Now he would die to change the social world. They hanged him on May 8th, along with 4 other conspirators, in the courtyard of Schlüsselburg fortress. The rope was too thick. It took him 20 minutes to die. The authorities sent his personal effects home in a small box. Some books, a photograph of his family, the gold watch his father had given him for graduating gymnasium, and a letter he'd written the night before his execution, telling his mother he regretted only the pain he'd caused her. Vladimir received the news at school. His classmates later remembered how he went completely white, how he walked out of the building without a word. They found him hours later by the Volga, staring at the water. When someone tried to comfort him by saying Sasha was a hero, Vladimir turned and said something strange. "No, we won't go that way. That's not the way." What way, then? In the weeks that followed, Vladimir threw himself into his studies with new ferocity. He memorized Latin texts, solved mathematical equations, wrote essays on Roman law, but his teachers noticed a change. The eager boy who'd once debated enthusiastically in class now sat silent, watching, calculating. When he did speak, his words had an edge that made others uncomfortable. The Ulyanovs became pariahs overnight. Friends crossed the street to avoid them. The authorities watched their house. Vladimir's gold medal couldn't get him into any university. Who would accept the brother of a terrorist? Only Kerensky would write him a recommendation letter, carefully phrased to emphasize the young man's academic brilliance, while distancing him from his brother's crimes. That summer, the family grieved in Simbirsk. They sold the house for whatever they could get. Later that year, after Vladimir's brief university stint in Kazan, the family would retreat to Kokushkino, the rural estate of Maria Alexandrovna's family. The main house was white-columned, gracious, a remnant of the old gentry life that was already fading. Vladimir took over a small wing, turning it into his study. It was during his exile in Kokushkino, following his expulsion, that he spent months reading intensively. He read political pamphlets denouncing autocracy. Works by Pisarev and Dobrolyubov, the radical critics who'd inspired a generation of revolutionaries. And one book in particular that Sasha had likely read, and which now deeply influenced Vladimir, Chernyshevsky's What Is to Be Done. The novel was terrible as literature. Wooden characters, implausible plot, prose like a police report. But Vladimir didn't read it for style. He read it for the vision of new people who rejected traditional morality and built their lives on rational principles. Its protagonist, Rakhmetov, slept on nails to toughen himself for the revolutionary struggle. He ate only food that ordinary workers could afford. He turned himself into an instrument of history. Vladimir began his own transformation. He started each day with cold baths and calisthenics, training his body while his mind absorbed revolutionary literature. He played chess against himself, analyzing each game afterward to eliminate weaknesses. He walked for hours through the countryside, always alone, always thinking. His sister Anna watched him with growing concern. The brother she'd known, who'd laughed easily and played practical jokes, was disappearing. In his place stood someone harder, more focused, frighteningly disciplined. When she tried to talk to him about Sasha, he would listen politely, then change the subject to economic statistics or European politics. By autumn, he'd read What Is to Be Done multiple times. Each reading revealed new layers. Chernyshevsky hadn't just written about revolution, he'd provided a manual for creating revolutionaries. Take yourself apart, analyze each component, rebuild yourself for maximum effectiveness. Emotion was inefficient. Sentiment was weakness. The future belonged to those who could think clearly and act decisively. Vladimir Ulyanov was 17 years old, brilliant, angry, and completely alone. His father's dream of gradual progress had died with him. His brother's romantic terrorism had led to the noose. Somewhere between these failures lay another path, but finding it would require becoming someone new, someone harder, someone who could wait, plan, and strike only when victory was certain. The boy who'd grieved by the Volga was gone. What remained was the raw material for Lenin. Chapter 3: Forging a Different Path. Kazan University finally accepted him in August 1887, but Vladimir Ulyanov lasted exactly 3 months. The authorities were watching for any sign of rebellion from the executed terrorist's brother. They didn't have to wait long. His first weeks at university passed quietly. Vladimir attended lectures in the law faculty, took notes in his precise handwriting, spoke to almost no one. His room in a boarding house near the university was monastically spare. A bed, a desk, a shelf of books. Other students found him unsettling. He had a way of listening that made you feel he was memorizing your words for future use. But beneath the disciplined exterior, rage simmered. Every mention of the law's majesty, every professor's casual reference to the wisdom of autocracy, every reminder that he was here on sufferance, it all fed the fire. He'd come to Kazan planning to keep his head down, earn his degree, find another way forward. The university had other plans for him. December 4th. A student meeting about university regulations turned into something larger. The inspector had announced new rules: stricter supervision of student organizations, mandatory attendance at Orthodox services, a ban on gatherings of more than 5 students without permission. Someone shouted that they were being treated like criminals. Someone else mentioned the martyred students of Petersburg. Within minutes, the meeting became a demonstration. Vladimir stood near the front, not speaking but present, visible, defiant. When someone asked if he was related to Alexander Ulyanov, he said yes, loudly, clearly. The crowd surged around him. Here was revolutionary royalty, the brother of a martyr. When the police arrived, he was among the first arrested. The officers found his name on their lists. They'd been waiting for him. The interrogation was brief. The police inspector, a man who'd clearly done this before, didn't even pretend to investigate. "Your brother chose his path," he said. "Will you choose the same?" Vladimir stared at him, saying nothing. The inspector shrugged. Expelled. Exiled to Kokushkino under police supervision. Be grateful, it's not worse. Back at Kokushkino, Vladimir found a different kind of prison. The estate was beautiful, isolated, deadly quiet. His mother watched him constantly, terrified of losing another son. His younger siblings tiptoed around him. Even the servants seemed afraid. He was the dangerous one now, the carrier of revolutionary contagion. He turned his grandfather's old study into his workspace. Books arrived by mail. His mother, despite everything, still believed education was salvation. He ordered German philosophy, French history, English economics. It was during his subsequent time in Kazan, after restrictions were loosened, that he seriously encountered Marx. Das Kapital was a key text, which he studied intently. The book was legal, technically, just another work of economic theory. The authorities didn't understand that it was more explosive than any bomb. Marx was different from the Russian radicals he'd read before. No moral outrage, no appeals to justice or humanity. Just cold analysis of how capitalism worked, why it would destroy itself, how history moved through predictable stages. After the passion and poetry of the populists, Marx felt like switching from candlelight to electricity. Suddenly, Vladimir could see the machinery behind events. He spent the winter, following his return to Kazan, constructing elaborate charts and diagrams, trying to understand Marx's formulas. His notebooks filled with calculations about surplus value and the falling rate of profit. When the equations finally clicked, when he understood how exploitation wasn't a moral failing but a structural necessity of capitalism, he felt the same clarity he'd found in Chernyshevsky. Here was science, not sentiment. His sister, Anna, herself, banned from higher education for her connection to Sasha, watched him transform. They would walk in the snow-covered gardens, and he would explain Marx's discoveries with the enthusiasm others reserved for love or God. "Don't you see?" he'd say. "It's not about good or evil. It's about understanding the laws of social development. Revolution isn't a choice. It's an inevitability." Spring came, and with it a slight loosening of restrictions. The police allowed him to visit Kazan for a day, to collect his belongings. The city felt different, smaller, shabbier, less important. He walked past the university without stopping. That chapter was closed. He was teaching himself now, preparing for struggles the professors couldn't imagine. His mother petitioned endlessly for her son's readmission to university. The authorities offered a compromise. He could take the law exams as an external student. No lectures, no contact with other students, just examinations. It was humiliating, but Vladimir accepted. A law degree was a tool, nothing more. He'd use whatever tools were available. He organized his studies like a military campaign. 4 hours of Roman law, 2 hours of civil procedure, 1 hour of legal history. He managed to prepare for and pass a demanding set of exams. When he finally sat for the exams in St. Petersburg in 1891, he scored exceptionally well. The professors were amazed. How had an exile, studying alone, outperformed their best students? They didn't understand that Vladimir wasn't studying to become a lawyer. He was studying to understand the enemy's weapons. Every law, Every procedure, every legal fiction revealed how the ruling class maintained power. The knowledge would be useful someday, when the old laws were swept away and new ones written. With his degree in hand, he returned to Samara, where his mother had moved the family in 1889. He went through the motions of starting a legal practice. His business card read, Vladimir Ulyanov, assistant attorney. He rented an office, bought the required legal texts, waited for clients. They came slowly. Peasants who'd been cheated by landlords, workers fired without pay. He took their cases, argued competently, usually lost. The real work happened after hours, in the illegal study circles that met in back rooms and private apartments. Vladimir attended with growing authority. He wasn't just another angry young man anymore. He could quote Marx in German, explain the development of Russian capitalism with statistics, demolish populist arguments with surgical precision. The terrorists wanted to blow up the system. The populists wanted to bypass it. Vladimir wanted to understand it, master it, use its own logic against it. One evening in Samara, during a particularly heated discussion about revolutionary tactics, Vladimir suddenly laughed. Not a pleasant laugh. His sister, Anna, who was there, later called it metallic. When asked what was funny, he said the whole discussion reminded him of people arguing about the best way to kill a bear before anyone had found the bear or loaded their rifle. First, he argued, they needed to understand Russian capitalism, how it was developing, where it was vulnerable. Then they needed to identify the social forces that would destroy it. Only then could they talk about tactics. Everything else was revolutionary phrase-making, as useless as his brother's bombs. By 1892, he was writing his own analyses, not the passionate calls to action that filled the illegal press, but dense economic studies backed by government statistics. How many factories had opened in the last decade? How many peasants had become workers? What did the growth of the railroad network mean for social development? Dry questions, but Vladimir believed the answers contained the future. His legal practice withered. He had no talent for courtroom drama and less interest. His mother supported him as always, supplementing his meager earnings with family money. He lived simply, spent nothing on himself, used every kopeck for books and paper. He was 22 years old, brilliant, disciplined, and absolutely certain he'd found the key to tomorrow. All he needed now was an organization worthy of his certainty. The provinces were too small for what he envisioned. St. Petersburg called the capital, the industrial heartland, the place where theory could become practice. In August 1893, he closed his failed law practice, packed his books, and bought a third-class train ticket north. The real work was about to begin. Chapter 4. The Unfurled Banner. Vladimir arrived in St. Petersburg on August 31st, 1893, stepping off the train into a city that assaulted every sense. The Finland station teemed with peasants seeking factory work, their bundles and bewildered faces marking them as fresh from the countryside. Smoke from 1,000 chimneys turned the afternoon sun into a dim orange disk. The air tasted of coal and human sweat. He found a room on Kazakya Street, near enough to the factories to hear their morning whistles but respectable enough to avoid police attention. The landlady, a German widow, appreciated his quiet habits and prompt rent payments. She had no idea her studious tenant would one day order the execution of thousands like her. The Marxist circles in Petersburg were different from the provincial discussion groups he'd known. These people had connections to actual workers. They printed illegal newspapers in hidden cellars. They knew which factory foreman would look the other way during lunch hour meetings. Vladimir threw himself into this world with characteristic intensity. But something bothered him from the start. Everyone agreed on the basics. Capitalism was evil. Revolution was coming. History was on their side. What nobody could explain was how they'd get from here to there. The populists still dreamed of peasant communes somehow leaping straight to socialism. The terrorists still believed a few well-placed bombs could bring down the autocracy. The Marxists knew better, but their knowledge hadn't translated into a practical program. Vladimir spent his first months listening, learning, mapping the underground's geography. There was the Bruzhnev group, mostly students who discovered Marx, the Radchenko Circle, which had better worker contacts, various Polish and Jewish socialists with their own organizations, all revolutionary, all illegal, all talking past each other in a babble of competing theories. He tested his ideas carefully at first. In a meeting about worker education, he argued that teaching literacy wasn't enough. Workers needed to understand their historical role. When discussing strike support, he insisted on connecting economic demands to political consciousness. Gradually, people began to notice the young lawyer from the provinces who quoted statistics like scripture and never seemed to doubt. That winter, he began writing what would become his first major theoretical work. The manuscript grew through the dark months, fueled by endless cigarettes and cups of tea. He called it What the Friends of the People Are and How They Fight the Social Democrats. The title dripped sarcasm. The Friends were populist intellectuals who claimed to love the people while misunderstanding everything about them. But Vladimir's real target wasn't the populists. It was confusion itself, the revolutionary movement's inability to see clearly. Page after page, he hammered home his central insight. Russia was becoming capitalist, whether anyone liked it or not. The old peasant commune was dying. Modern industry was being born, and with it came the force that would destroy it, the industrial proletariat. He painted history as a three-act drama, as outlined in his banner sentence from this work. Act 1 involved the creation of Russian social democracy. Advanced representatives of the working class would assimilate socialist ideas, and durable organizations would transform sporadic economic struggles into a purposeful class struggle. Act 2 focused on the democratic revolution. The Russian worker, leading all democratic elements, would overthrow absolutism. Act 3 envisioned the social revolution. The Russian proletariat, alongside the proletariat of all countries, would take the direct road of open political struggle to the victorious communist revolution. Simple, elegant, inevitable. But Vladimir added something new. The protagonist of this drama, not the people in some vague romantic sense, not the peasants with their ancient grievances. The urban industrial workers, and specifically the conscious workers who understood their historical mission, they would be the engine of revolution. The manuscript circulated through the underground in handwritten copies. Vladimir insisted on using a hectograph, a primitive copying device using gelatin and purple ink to produce cleaner versions. Each page had to be pressed by hand, the purple letters growing fainter with each copy. He worked through the nights, his fingers stained violet, producing dozens of copies for distribution. The response was electric. Here was someone who wasn't just complaining about the present, but mapping the future. Someone who could quote Marx in one paragraph and Russian factory statistics in the next. Someone who wrote like he knew exactly where history was heading and had bought his ticket in advance. The purple pamphlets passed from hand to hand, read in workers' barracks and student apartments. But Vladimir wasn't satisfied with theoretical victory. He wanted to test his ideas in practice. Through the underground network, he made contact with workers from the Semyanikov factory. These weren't the grey masses of populist imagination, but thinking individuals. Ivan Babushkin, who read everything he could find. Vasily Shelgunov, who organized his shop floor with military precision. He met them in tea shops and private apartments, always careful, always watching for police spies. But instead of lecturing, he listened. How did wages actually work? What grievances burned hottest? Which foremen were tyrants, and which merely incompetent? He took notes like an anthropologist studying a new civilization. From these conversations came a new kind of leaflet. Not abstract calls for revolution, but specific demands, tailored to each factory. The Thornton mill workers wanted ventilation. Their leaflet explained how cotton dust destroyed lungs and why British factories had fans. The Putilov workers faced arbitrary fines. Their leaflet detailed every illegal deduction, named the guilty foreman, demanded precise remedies. Each leaflet ended the same way, connecting the immediate struggle to the larger war. Your fight for clean air is part of the fight for human dignity. Your demand for fair wages is a demand for justice. Unite with your fellow workers, first in your shop, then in your factory, then across all Petersburg. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Vladimir supervised every detail. The paper had to be thin enough to hide, but strong enough to pass through many hands. The type had to be clear. Workers read by candlelight after exhausting shifts. The language had to be simple, without being condescending. Each word was weighed, tested, refined. By spring of 1894, his network reached into a dozen factories. Workers who'd never heard of Marx 6 months ago were explaining surplus value to their benchmates. Study circles met in workers' apartments, disguised as name day celebrations or funeral gatherings. The spark was catching, slowly but surely. Vladimir began dreaming bigger. Leaflets were good, but they needed a newspaper, something regular, professional, that could bind scattered circles into a real movement. He sketched plans in his notebooks, calculating costs, planning distribution networks, imagining a publication that would be the scaffolding for a future party. That summer, he met Nadezhda Krupskaya at a Shrove Tuesday gathering of radicals. She taught at workers' evening schools, turning literacy lessons into political education. Vladimir watched her explain complex ideas using simple objects, matchboxes for factories, kopecks for wages, breadcrumbs for surplus value. Here was someone who understood that revolution required patience and pedagogy. They began working together, sharing contacts and information. She had access to workers he couldn't reach, women in the textile mills, teenagers in the cigarette factories. He provided theoretical clarity and organizational vision. It wasn't romance in any conventional sense, but something deeper, a recognition of shared purpose. By autumn, the authorities were noticing increased unrest in the factories. Police reports mentioned mysterious leaflets, unexpected work stoppages, workers asking uncomfortable questions. They couldn't find the source. Vladimir had learned from his brother's mistakes. No bombs, no dramatic gestures, just patient building of networks that grew like roots beneath the city. Years later, when Vladimir Ulyanov had become Lenin, and his three-act play had somehow actually happened, though nothing like he'd imagined, people would trace it back to this moment. A young man in a cold room in Petersburg, pressing purple letters onto cheap paper, absolutely certain he'd found the key to tomorrow. The certainty would carry him through prison, exile, and revolution. It would also blind him to possibilities he'd never imagined, tragedies his schemer couldn't predict. But that was still to come. For now, there was only the work, the careful, patient work of turning theory into practice. One leaflet, one worker, one factory at a time. The bear was out there, somewhere in the Russian darkness. Vladimir was loading his rifle with ideas sharper than any bullet. When the moment came, he would be ready. History had promised him that much. Chapter 5. Petersburg's Cauldron. The winter of 1894 descended on Petersburg like a gray shroud. Ice formed on the inside of windows, coal smoke hung so thick you could taste it, and in the workers' districts, families huddled together for warmth, burning furniture when the coal ran out. In this frozen city, Vladimir Ulyanov's underground network grew like frost on glass, invisible until suddenly it was everywhere. He'd established a routine that looked respectable to any watching police. Morning walks along Nevsky Prospect, afternoons in the public library, evenings at home with his books. But the walks included coded conversations at predetermined corners. The library visits meant messages left in agreed-upon volumes. The quiet evenings were spent writing leaflets that would soon have factory owners screaming for blood. The Marxist circles were coalescing into something larger. Vladimir had identified the serious revolutionaries from the mere talkers, those willing to risk prison from those who preferred theoretical debates over tea. There was Gleb Krezhizanovsky, an engineer who understood machinery both industrial and organizational. There was Peter Struve, brilliant but soft, already showing signs of the liberalism that would later split them apart. And there was Julius Martov, who arrived that autumn like a comet trailing revolutionary fire. Where Vladimir was all discipline and calculation, Martov burned with empathy for human suffering. He was younger, Jewish, perpetually disheveled, with wire-rimmed spectacles that couldn't hide eyes that had seen too much, too young. They met at an underground gathering and recognized each other instantly, not as friends, but as necessary partners in the work ahead. Martov brought connections to the Jewish workers in the Pale of Settlement, to Polish socialists, to radical students Vladimir's austere manner couldn't reach. Together, they walked the frozen Neva embankment, arguing about revolutionary strategy, while their breath crystallized in the Arctic air. Both were committed to advancing the workers' cause and political consciousness, though they might debate the immediate tactics. Neither convinced the other entirely, but both recognized they needed what the other offered. Through Krupskaya's evening classes, Vladimir gained access to a different layer of workers. Not the skilled metal workers who already questioned their conditions, but textile girls who worked 16-hour days, children who'd never learned to read, old women who cleaned the factories at night. Krupskaya taught them letters by day and revolution by night, using the same patient method for both. One December evening, Vladimir observed one of her classes. 20 workers crammed into a freezing basement, learning to read from texts that just happened to explain exploitation. The worker sells his labor, they recited. The owner steals the value. Basic sentences that planted seeds in minds numbed by exhaustion. Vladimir saw how hunger for education could become hunger for justice. He was developing his own teaching method, inspired by the German Social Democrats, but adapted to Russian conditions. Start with immediate grievances. The foreman who cheated on piecework, the fines for being minutes late, the woman fired for refusing the manager's advances. Connect these to larger patterns. Why did all foremen cheat? Why were fines legal? Why did managers have such power? Then reveal the system behind it all. Capitalism required exploitation. The state protected the exploiters. Only revolution could break the chain. But teaching required students, and Vladimir needed to understand his pupils better. He spent hours with advanced workers like Ivan Babushkin, not lecturing but listening. Babushkin described how skilled workers felt superior to peasant newcomers, how ethnic Russians resented Polish and Jewish workers, how men dismissed women's complaints. The proletariat of Marx's theory was divided by 1,000 prejudices. Unity would have to be built, not assumed. Vladimir adjusted his approach. Leaflets for the Putilov works emphasized Russian workers' traditions of resistance. Those for textile mills spoke to women's double burden of factory and family. Materials for the port workers acknowledged the specific dangers of their trade. Same message, different keys, all tuned to local frequencies. The police were catching on. The Okhrana had infiltrated most revolutionary circles, but Vladimir's cell structure made complete penetration difficult. Each member knew only their immediate contacts. Messages moved through cutouts and dead drops. Meetings rotated locations weekly. When veteran revolutionaries criticized these precautions as paranoid, Vladimir reminded them how many veterans were in Siberia. By spring of 1895, the network was producing a stream of propaganda. Not just leaflets now, but longer, pamphlets explaining economic theory in workers' language. Vladimir wrote most of them, but always collectively edited. Martov would add emotional appeals. Krupskaya would simplify complex passages. Grzhizhanovsky would check technical details. The final products bore no single style. They were genuinely collective works. Success brought new problems. More workers meant more expenses. Paper, printing, safe houses, support for full-time revolutionaries. The circle's middle-class members contributed what they could, but it wasn't enough. Vladimir proposed approaching liberal factory owners who might support worker education. Martov was horrified. Taking money from exploiters? Vladimir's response was typical. When the revolution comes, we'll confiscate the rest. That May, Vladimir received unexpected news. The authorities had granted him a passport for foreign travel, probably hoping he'd emigrate permanently. Instead, he saw opportunity. Europe was where the real social democratic parties operated openly, where Marx's ideas had built mass movements. He would go learn their methods, make connections, perhaps find funding. The Russian movement needed to emerge from its underground isolation. Before leaving, he spent a week transferring responsibilities. Martov would maintain worker contacts. Krupskaya would continue education work. Krupshijanovsky would handle technical matters. Each had addresses for emergency communication, codes for different levels of urgency, fallback plans if arrests began. Vladimir prepared for every contingency except the one that occurred, his own transformation by what he would see abroad. His last night in Petersburg, the inner circle gathered in a safe apartment near the Technological Institute. They drank tea, smoked endless cigarettes, talked until dawn about the future they were building. Martov spoke of the day when workers would control their own factories. Krupskaya imagined schools where children learned truth instead of superstition. Vladimir said little, but when pressed, admitted he dreamed of a party, disciplined, centralized, professional, that would focus revolutionary energy like a lens focusing light. They parted as the sun rose over the city's smokestacks. Vladimir walked to the Warsaw station alone, carrying one suitcase and a head full of plans. He was 25 years old, absolutely certain of his path, about to discover how much he still had to learn. Switzerland awaited, and with it Plekhanov, the father of Russian Marxism. Then Germany, where the Social Democrats had millions of members. Then London, where Marx himself had worked. The train pulled out past factories where workers were beginning their shifts. Some carried leaflets hidden in their clothes, words Vladimir had written now spreading through the industrial bloodstream of the city. The spark was lit. Now he would learn how to fan it into flame. He settled into his seat, pulled out a German grammar and began to study. There was so much work ahead. Chapter 6. The Exhilaration of the Strike. Vladimir crossed the border in the summer of 1895, watching Russia disappear behind him. First stop, Switzerland, where Plekhanov and the old guard of Russian Marxism lived in exile. He traveled third class, saving money, observing how European workers dressed, moved, spoke. Every detail mattered for the party he was designing in his head. Geneva disappointed him. The Russian exiles met in the same cafes where revolutionaries had argued for decades, repeating the same debates about terrorism versus propaganda, peasants versus workers. Plekhanov himself, the legendary translator of Marx, turned out to be vain, pedantic, more concerned with theoretical purity than practical organization. When Vladimir described his Petersburg work, Plekhanov's reaction was not the enthusiastic endorsement he might have hoped for. But Vladimir learned what he could. The exiles had connections across Europe, access to printing facilities, experience smuggling literature into Russia. He took notes on everything: which borders were easiest to cross, which shipping companies asked fewer questions, how to hide pamphlets in legal book shipments. Revolution required logistics as much as ideology. From Switzerland to France, where he met Paul Lafargue, Marx's son-in-law. The old man reminisced about the founder while Vladimir pressed for practical details. How had Marx organized the First International? What mistakes had been made? Lafargue was more interested in telling stories about Marx's carbuncles than discussing organizational structure, but Vladimir extracted what he could. Then, Germany, the promised land of social democracy. Berlin overwhelmed him, a modern industrial city that made Petersburg look medieval. The Social Democratic Party had 3 million members, 90 newspapers, representatives in parliament. They operated openly, held massive rallies, ran schools and libraries. This was what success looked like. He met Wilhelm Liebknecht, the party's grand old man, who received him kindly but clearly saw him as just another Russian dreamer. Vladimir attended party meetings, watched how they were run, the formal procedures, the voting mechanisms, the way disputes were channeled into productive debate rather than faction fights. He filled notebook after notebook with observations. But something bothered him. The German party was too comfortable, too legal, too invested in gradual reform. They talked about revolution while acting like a permanent opposition. When Vladimir suggested their methods might not work under Tsarist repression, his hosts smiled condescendingly. Russia would democratize. Eventually, they assured him. Then Russian Social Democrats could operate like civilized Europeans. In Berlin's workers' districts, he found a different story. Rank-and-file members complained that the leadership had grown conservative, more interested in parliamentary seats than revolution. The party's success had become its cage. Vladimir filed this lesson away. Legal operation could be as dangerous as underground conspiracy if it dulled revolutionary edge. By August, he was back in Russia, his head spinning with new knowledge. But Petersburg had changed in his absence. The network he'd carefully built was expanding beyond his plans. Workers were organizing themselves, demanding action, not waiting for intellectual guidance. Some comrades saw this as wonderful spontaneity. Vladimir saw danger, movement without direction, energy without focus. He threw himself back into work with renewed intensity. Using German methods adapted to Russian conditions, he restructured the circles into a more disciplined organization. Each factory would have its own cell. Cells would coordinate through district committees, districts through a central group. Information would flow up, decisions down, like the German party, but built for illegality. That autumn brought unexpected opportunity. Management at several textile factories announced wage cuts, blaming foreign competition. Workers who'd been reading underground leaflets for months suddenly had immediate reason to act. Strikes began sporadically. A shop here, a department there. Vladimir and his comrades worked frantically to coordinate them, to transform spontaneous protest into organized resistance. December 8th, 1895. Vladimir sat in his room writing a leaflet about the latest factory abuses when he heard footsteps on the stairs. Too heavy for his landlady, too purposeful for a casual visitor. He had seconds to burn the most incriminating papers. The police broke down his door just as the last pages caught flame. They arrested 40 others that same night. The Okhrana had been watching longer than anyone realized, letting the network grow before striking. Martov, Krzyzanowski, most of the central circle all taken. Only Krupskaya escaped the first sweep, managing to destroy membership lists before her own arrest. 3 months later. Vladimir found himself in the house of preliminary detention, the same fortress prison where his brother had spent his last weeks. The authorities seemed almost disappointed by their catch. No bombs, no assassination plans. Just leaflets about working conditions and German books about economics. They'd expected terrorists and found school teachers. But outside the prison walls, something extraordinary was happening. The arrests, rather than crushing the movement, catalyzed it. Workers who'd hesitated to act now had martyrs to avenge. The strikes that had been simmering all autumn exploded into the open. By June 1896, 30,000 textile workers had walked off the job, the largest strike in Russian history. In his cell, Vladimir could hear the demonstrations, workers marching past the prison, singing the songs Krupskaya had taught, chanting demands he'd helped formulate. Everything he'd theorized was happening without him. Workers discovering their power, connecting economic and political demands, learning through struggle what no leaflet could teach. He pressed against his window, trying to see the crowds. Guards reported he seemed almost happy, despite imprisonment. He was. The strikes validated everything. Russian workers weren't backward peasants, but a genuine proletariat capable of organized action. The spark had caught. Now it was spreading on its own logic. The strikes were a major event. The government, terrified of wider unrest, eventually passed a law in June 1897 that limited working hours. More important was the psychological shift. Workers had tasted power. They wanted more. In prison, Vladimir analyzed every detail he could glean from lawyers' visits and smuggled messages. Why had some factories held firm while others wavered? How had workers maintained discipline without experienced leaders? Which demands resonated most? He filled notebook after notebook, preparing for battles yet to come. The authorities faced a dilemma. The prisoners were clearly dangerous, but trials might provoke more unrest. After 14 months, they chose administrative exile, 3 years in Siberia, far from factories and workers. Vladimir received the sentence calmly. Siberia meant time to think, to write, to prepare for the next round. As he prepared for exile, messages arrived from comrades still free. The movement had survived the arrests, even grown. New people had stepped forward. Workers who'd participated in the strikes were teaching others. The underground newspapers continued publishing. The organization he'd built proved more durable than its architects. His last days in Petersburg prison were spent writing instructions for those who remained. Keep the factory cells, maintain security procedures, connect economic agitation to political goals, and above all, prepare for his return. This was just the first act. The real drama was yet to come. January 1897. Vladimir boarded the train for Siberia, manacled but unbroken. Through the window, he watched the city's smokestacks disappear. Somewhere in those factories, workers carried hidden leaflets, attended secret meetings, prepared for struggles ahead. The spark had become a flame. His job now was to think about how to forge that flame into a weapon that could shatter an empire. 3 years in Siberia should be enough time to design it. Chapter 7. Siberian Interlude. Global Vision. The journey to Shushensko took 2 months. First, the Trans-Siberian Railway as far as it went, then sledges through forests where wolves howled in the darkness. Finally, a riverboat down the Yenisei as the ice began to break. With each mile, Europe receded, and Asia swallowed him. Vladimir watched from the train window as Russia revealed its true vastness, its stubborn refusal to fit into any theory. He arrived in May 1897 to find Shushensko wasn't the frozen hell he'd expected. The village sat in a valley ringed by mountains, with clean air that made his Petersburg damaged lungs ache with forgotten health. Political exiles were allowed to live freely within the district, rent rooms from locals, receive mail and money. The Tsarist state, for all its cruelty, maintained odd pockets of civilized treatment. Vladimir rented 2 rooms from a prosperous peasant, one for sleeping, one for working. Within days, he'd established a routine as rigid as any prison schedule. Rise at 8, cold bath in the Yenisei, 4 hours of writing, lunch, 2 hours of reading, long walk, evening correspondence, chess with fellow exiles, bed at midnight. The same every day, as if revolution could be accomplished through sheer disciplined repetition. His mother sent money monthly, supplementing the government allowance. Vladimir used it to order books, crate after crate arriving from Moscow, Petersburg, Berlin. Marx and Engels, of course, but also statistics on Russian agriculture, German philosophy, French history, English economics. His peasant landlord, watching the library grow, asked if he was planning to open a school. In a way, Vladimir replied. The first project was massive, proving scientifically that Russia was becoming capitalist. Not because he liked the idea, but because revolution required a proletariat, and a proletariat required capitalism. The populists still insisted Russia could skip capitalism entirely, jump straight from peasant communes to socialism. Beautiful dream, Vladimir thought, but dreams didn't make revolution. He gathered statistics like a miser hoarding gold, railway construction miles, factory output figures, grain export data, rural unemployment rates. Each number was a bullet in his theoretical arsenal. Page by page, table by table, he built an irrefutable case. Russia was industrializing whether romantics liked it or not. The peasant commune was dissolving. Wage labor was spreading. History was moving. 800 pages later, the development of capitalism in Russia was complete. Dry as dust, but Vladimir didn't write to entertain. He wrote to prove that Russian Marxists weren't dreamers, but scientists observing an objective process. The book would be published legally. The censors saw only economic statistics, missing the revolutionary implications. Krupskaya arrived in May 1898, having manipulated her exile to join him. They married in July, with copper rings, borrowed from witnesses, more merger than romance. She brought news from European Russia. The movement survived, but lacked direction. Different cities pursued different strategies. Some focused on economic strikes, others on student protests, still others on terrorism's return. Without central leadership, energy dissipated in all directions. Together they developed the solution, a newspaper. Not the local leaflets they'd produced before, but a real publication printed abroad and smuggled throughout Russia. It would be called Iskra, the Spark, from the Decembrist poem, From a spark will come a conflagration. Every issue would carry tactical guidance, theoretical education, and practical news. Most importantly, it would be the scaffolding around which a real party could crystallize. But a newspaper required more than good intentions. It needed money, printing facilities, distribution networks, and above all, writers who could translate Marxist theory into Russian practice. Vladimir began corresponding with comrades across the empire, building support, delegating tasks. From his Siberian isolation, he was constructing an organization that existed mainly in his imagination. The plan grew more ambitious. Not just a newspaper, but a whole system. Professional revolutionaries working full-time, supported by party funds, moving between cities under false identities. An underground army as disciplined as any military force, but fighting with ideas instead of guns. Local committees would have autonomy in tactics, but unity in strategy. Democratic discussion, but iron discipline once decisions were made. Fellow exiles visited regularly, drawn by Vladimir's certainty. They'd sit around the samovar debating organizational principles while mosquitoes whined through Siberian dusk. Some argued for loose federation. Let each city find its own way. Vladimir insisted on centralization. The autocracy is centralized, he'd say. We can't fight it with anarchist poetry. He was changing in exile, becoming harder, more focused. The young man who'd grieved for his brother was buried under layers of theory and strategy. Krupskaya watched the transformation with admiration tinged by unease. The Vladimir who emerged from his study each evening seemed less human, more instrument. Even his jokes had edges that cut. Letters arrived from the West with troubling news. Some comrades were abandoning revolutionary goals, talking about legal trade unions and gradual reform. Eduard Bernstein in Germany was revising Marx, arguing capitalism might reform itself peacefully. In Russia, the legal Marxists like Struve were sliding toward liberalism. The movement was fracturing before it had properly formed. Vladimir's responses were savage. Revisionism was betrayal. Legal Marxism was bourgeois infection. Reform was a ruling class trick. His letters grew longer, angrier, filled with warnings about ideological contamination. Revolution wasn't a buffet where you chose dishes to taste. It was all or nothing, victory or death. By late 1899, his exile was winding down. The police would allow him to live anywhere except major cities. He planned, along with Martov and Potrasov, to go abroad to establish their newspaper. His last months in Shushensko were spent in feverish preparation. He drafted the newspaper's program, outlined its first year of issues, calculated printing costs and smuggling routes. Krupskaya coded addresses of reliable comrades across the empire. Everything was ready except the newspaper itself. His term of exile ended in early 1900. Vladimir stood on the frozen Yenisei for the last time, watching the sun set behind mountains that had bounded his world for 3 years. Siberia had been his university and monastery, combined, a place to think without distraction, to forge himself into the instrument history required. The boy who'd arrived was gone. What remained was Lenin, though he didn't use that name yet. The journey back to European Russia reversed his earlier exile, riverboat to railway to civilization. but Vladimir barely noticed the landscape. His mind was already in Switzerland, Germany, London, wherever Iskra would be born. The spark had survived Siberia. Now it was time to spread the fire. He left Shushensko with 2 suitcases, one full of clothes, one full of manuscripts. The clothes would wear out within months. The manuscripts would help destroy an empire. At the railway station, saying goodbye to fellow exiles, someone asked if he'd miss Siberia. "I'll be back," Vladimir said. Everyone laughed, thinking he meant as a tourist. History had darker plans. Chapter 8. The Spark and the Pen. In July 1900, Vladimir crossed the Russian border, traveling on a mission that would consume the next 17 years. After his Siberian exile ended in early 1900, he had met with comrades like Martov and Potresov to concert their plans. Ahead lay Western Europe, where Iskra would be born or the Russian Revolution would remain forever stillborn. His first stop after initial meetings in Geneva was Munich, where German comrades had offered printing facilities. The city overwhelmed him with its bourgeois prosperity. Beer gardens where workers drank alongside their bosses, streets so clean you could eat off them, a social peace that made revolution seem like madness. But Vladimir wasn't there for the beer. He needed a press, paper, and above all collaborators who shared his vision. The negotiations proved harder than expected. Plekhanov, the grand old man of Russian Marxism, displayed his characteristic prickliness. Axelrod wanted the paper to focus on theoretical education. Zasulich insisted on including appeals to liberal conscience. Everyone agreed Iskra was necessary, but each had their own vision of what it should be. Vladimir spent weeks in Swiss cafes, managing egos as carefully as any diplomat. Finally, a compromise emerged. 6 editors, the old guard of Plekhanov, Axelrod, and Zasulich, plus the younger generation of Lenin, Martov, and Potresov. Decisions by majority vote. Vladimir accepted, knowing he could outwork and outmaneuver the others. Let them have their votes. He would have the newspaper. The first issue appeared in December 1900. 8 pages of tightly printed text, smuggled into Russia in false-bottomed suitcases and sewn into coat linings. The masthead carried their motto, "From a spark will come a conflagration." Inside, articles on strikes, theoretical essays, tactical advice, and Vladimir's editorial, setting out their program, not just a newspaper, but the scaffolding for a revolutionary party. Distribution was its own revolution. Networks of smugglers carried bundles across borders, students with hollowed-out textbooks, merchants with double-lined trunks, sailors with waterproof packages. Inside Russia, the papers moved through chains of safe houses, each link knowing only the next. A copy might travel thousands of miles, be read by hundreds, before finally disintegrating from handling. Vladimir wrote obsessively for every issue. Articles, some signed N, Lenin, a pseudonym he began using around 1901, possibly from a passport he'd obtained, appeared on everything from factory conditions to philosophical disputes. His style had crystallized in exile, short sentences like hammer blows, statistics deployed like artillery, sarcasm that could strip paint. Readers either loved or hated Lenin's voice. None ignored it. But his most important work of this period was a book that would transform Russian socialism, published in 1902, What is to be Done. Took its title from Chernyshevsky's novel that had shaped his youth. But the content was pure Lenin. The spontaneous strike movement was good, he argued, but insufficient. Workers on their own could only develop trade union consciousness, fighting for better conditions within capitalism. Revolutionary consciousness had to be brought from outside by professional revolutionaries armed with Marxist science. The book outlined his vision of the party, systematizing methods developed by social democratic activists. He argued for a corps of trained professional revolutionaries dedicated to the cause, essential for operating effectively under Russian conditions of Tsarist repression. He emphasized the need for a stable organization capable of guiding the burgeoning worker movement, inspired by the principles of European social democracy, but adapted to the specific challenges of the Russian underground: democratic centralism, free discussion until a decision was made, then absolute unity in action. He used a military metaphor that would haunt Russian socialism. The party would be like an army's general staff, the working class like soldiers. Generals didn't take votes before ordering attacks. They studied the battlefield, made plans, issued commands. Democracy was for peacetime. Russia was at war. "Give us an organization of revolutionaries," he wrote, "and we will overturn Russia." The sentence crystallized his conviction in the power of a dedicated, organized vanguard. This was not necessarily a break with traditional social democracy in his mind, but its focused application to the urgent task of making revolution in an autocratic state, built on confidence in the workers' revolutionary potential when properly led. The book landed like a bomb in revolutionary circles. Some hailed it as the practical program they'd been seeking. Others denounced it as elitist, conspiratorial, a recipe for dictatorship. Plekhanov, who'd initially supported Lenin, began having second thoughts. This wasn't the democratic socialism Marx had envisioned, but something harder, more Russian, more dangerous. Meanwhile, Iskra was succeeding beyond anyone's dreams. Each issue reached deeper into Russia, creating a common vocabulary for scattered revolutionaries. Factory workers in Petersburg read the same articles as Jewish Bundists in Poland, Georgian nationalists in Tiflis, students in Moscow. The newspaper was becoming what Lenin had envisioned, not just propaganda, but an organizing tool. But success brought problems. As Iskra's influence grew, so did disputes among its editors. Plekhanov resented Lenin's productivity and growing authority. Martov worried about the authoritarian implications of what is to be done. Zazulnik found Lenin's contempt for liberals disturbing. The editorial board meetings became battlegrounds, with Vladimir usually isolated, but never retreating. He compensated by building his own network within the network. Younger comrades drawn to his clarity and discipline became Iskra agents, spreading his particular interpretation of the newspaper's line. When local committees wrote for advice, Lenin always answered first and most thoroughly. Gradually, imperceptibly, Iskra was becoming Lenin's paper in fact, if not in name. The work was exhausting. Writing articles, editing submissions, managing distribution, maintaining correspondence with dozens of committees. fighting with co-editors, all while living on party stipends that barely covered rent and food. Vladimir developed headaches that would plague him for life. Krupskaya, who joined him after completing her exile, managed the practical details while he focused on politics. By 1902, they'd moved to London, driven from Munich by police pressure. The British capital suited Lenin better. No one paid attention to foreign revolutionaries scribbling in the British Museum. He spent days where Marx had worked, reading colonial reports and factory statistics, confirming his analysis of imperialism's role in postponing European revolution. London also meant proximity to the heart of world capitalism. Vladimir studied everything: how parliament functioned, how trade unions operated, how the ruling class maintained control through concession and co-optation rather than pure force. These lessons would prove invaluable when he finally held power, though he'd apply them in reverse. The Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party was scheduled for summer 1903. It would be Iskra's triumph. Delegates chosen largely from newspaper supporters. The agenda shaped by its political line. Lenin prepared meticulously, drafting rules, lining up votes, anticipating objections. This would be the moment his organizational vision became reality. He had no idea he was preparing for a split that would define the rest of his life. The party he'd spent years building was about to tear itself apart, creating the fundamental division of Russian socialism: Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, hards and softs, Lenin's disciples and everyone else. The spark had indeed created a conflagration. Now Vladimir would learn that fires, once started, burn in directions no one can control. But that spring in London, writing in the same library where Marx had labored, Vladimir allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Iskra reached every corner of the Russian Empire. What is to be done was debated in every underground circle. His vision of professional revolution was becoming reality. Soon, very soon, they would have their organization of revolutionaries, and then they would overturn Russia. Chapter 9. A People's Revolution. A Party Divided. The Second Congress convened in Brussels in August 1903, in a flower warehouse festooned with red bunting. 57 delegates representing 26 organizations gathered to forge Russian social democracy into a real party. Vladimir had spent months preparing, but revolutions, even small ones in Belgian warehouses, never follow scripts. From the first session, problems emerged. The Jewish Bund demanded autonomy within the party. Polish socialists wanted recognition as sole representatives of Polish workers. Economists argued for focus on immediate demands. Each group had read Iskra differently, seen their own hopes reflected in its pages. Now they discovered these hopes were incompatible. Vladimir sat in the Presidium, taking notes in his meticulous hand, cataloguing friends and enemies. He'd arrived with what seemed like a solid Iskra majority. But majorities, he was learning, were as unstable as Russian spring ice. Every vote revealed new fractures. Old alliances dissolved over procedural questions that masked deeper disagreements about revolution's meaning. The Belgian police, pressured by the Russian embassy, shut down the Congress after a week. The delegates scattered to London, reconvening in a dingy hall usually used for socialist lectures and worker celebrations. The venue's shabbiness seemed appropriate. Here was Russian social democracy, supposedly ready to overthrow an empire, unable to secure a decent meeting room. Then came the explosion. Paragraph 1 of the party rules defining membership. Lenin proposed that members must personally participate in party organizations. Martov countered that personal participation was too restrictive. Anyone who supported the party should be considered a member. The difference seemed trivial, but both men understood its implications. Lenin wanted professional revolutionaries. Martov wanted a mass movement. The debate consumed entire sessions. Lenin argued that loose membership meant police infiltration, that Russian conditions demanded conspiracy, that better to have 10 real workers than 100 sympathizers. Martov replied that Lenin's formula would create a sect of intellectuals commanding passive masses, that socialism meant democratic participation, that walls between party and class would breed dictatorship. When the vote came, Lenin lost on this crucial point regarding party membership definition. But politics, like chess, rewards patience. Later votes on other issues saw walkouts by the Bund and economists. On some subsequent matters, Lenin's faction found itself in the majority. He seized the moment, attempting to solidify his influence on key party bodies. Martov exploded. "This was a coup," he shouted, "a violation of comradely ethics. How could Lenin try to sideline respected figures?" But Vladimir remained calm. They had voted, hadn't they? The majority had decided on those later issues. From now on, his supporters would be called Bolsheviks, majoritarians. Martov's group became Mensheviks, minoritarians. The names stuck even after subsequent events made them mathematically absurd. The Congress ended in chaos. Martov refused to serve on an editorial board he felt was unfairly constituted. Plekhanov, appalled by the split, initially tried to mediate, but eventually leaned away from Lenin's hard line. Within months, Lenin found himself increasingly isolated, and by the end of the year was forced to leave the Iskra editorial board, the leader of a faction whose future was uncertain. The party he'd spent years building had shattered at birth. But defeat taught Lenin more than victory could have. In Geneva, writing furious pamphlets defending his position, he developed the ideas that would define Bolshevism. The party needed iron discipline because history offered only brief opportunities. Revolutionary moments came rarely. Miss them and wait decades for another chance. Better a small, sharp sword than a large, dull club. He also learned about betrayal. Plekhanov, his theoretical mentor, now called him a dictator. Martov, his closest comrade, painted him as power-hungry. Even Krupskaya questioned whether he'd been too harsh. But Lenin had crossed his Rubicon. Soft sentiments were for liberals. Revolution required hardness all the way through. Then, in January 1905, history provided its verdict. News arrived from Petersburg. Troops had fired on workers marching to petition the Tsar. Hundreds dead, thousands wounded. The massacre triggered strikes, mutinies, uprisings across the empire. While social democrats bickered in exile, Russian workers and peasants began their own revolution. Lenin watched from Geneva with fascination and frustration. Everything was happening too fast, without proper organization. Workers formed their own councils, Soviets, ignoring party guidance. Peasants burned manor houses without reading Marx. Sailors mutinied on the battleship Potemkin without consulting professional revolutionaries. The masses were writing their own script. This was what he'd warned against: spontaneity without consciousness, energy without direction. Yet he couldn't deny the revolution's grandeur. Workers who'd never heard of socialism were creating embryonic socialist institutions. Peasants who couldn't read were destroying centuries of oppression. Perhaps the masses understood more than intellectuals gave them credit for. He threw himself into analyzing events, writing article after article for the new Bolshevik paper. The Mensheviks argued the revolution must be bourgeois, overthrowing Tsarism to establish capitalism, with workers playing a supporting role. Lenin developed a different formula: democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. Workers would lead, bringing peasants along, pushing the bourgeois revolution to its limits and beyond. By autumn, he could stand Geneva no longer. Despite the risks, he was still wanted by the police. Lenin returned to Russia in November. The empire he found bore no resemblance to the one he'd left. Soviets governed Petersburg. Armed workers patrolled Moscow streets. The Tsar's October Manifesto had promised a constitution, creating space for open political activity. But Lenin saw what others missed. The revolution was already ebbing. The Tsar's concessions had split the opposition. Liberals, satisfied with promises of parliament, abandoned the streets. The army remained mostly loyal. December's Moscow uprising, which Bolsheviks supported, was crushed by artillery. By year's end, reaction was setting in. The 1905 revolution failed, but it taught invaluable lessons. Soviets showed how workers could organize themselves. The peasant uprising revealed rural revolutionary potential. The liberal betrayal confirmed that workers could rely only on themselves. Most importantly, the revolution had been a dress rehearsal. Next time they'd know their parts better. Lenin escaped to Finland as arrests mounted, spending 1906 in a dacha outside Petersburg, close enough to smell gunpowder, but far enough to avoid police. He wrote obsessively, analyzing every aspect of the revolution, preparing for its next act. The party remained split, weaker than before the revolution it had failed to lead. But failure, properly studied, could be the best teacher. The split at the Second Congress had seemed like disaster. Now Lenin realized it had been necessary. A united party would have meant endless compromise, fatal hesitation at crucial moments. Better to have a small, disciplined force that could act decisively when history offered another chance. The Mensheviks could have the moral high ground. Lenin would take power. 1905 had shown that Russian workers and peasants were ready for revolution. It had also shown that spontaneous uprising wasn't enough. Someone had to provide strategy, coordination, the will to push forward when others retreated. That someone would be Lenin's Bolsheviks, hardened by defeat, preparing for victory. The dress rehearsal was over. Time to prepare for the real performance. Chapter 10. The Weight of Defeat, the Glimmer of Hope. The years after 1905 crushed Russian revolutionaries like a millstone grinding grain. Prime Minister Stolypin's necktie, the gallows, worked overtime. 3,000 executed, tens of thousands exiled to Siberia, hundreds of thousands imprisoned. The Soviets were dissolved, the unions banned, the revolutionary parties driven back underground. Hope itself became contraband. Lenin retreated deeper into Finland, then back to Western Europe, when even Finland became unsafe. The Bolshevik organization he'd built with such care began disintegrating. Members fled abroad, were arrested, or simply gave up. Treasury funds evaporated. The party that would one day rule the largest country on earth couldn't afford to rent a decent meeting hall in Geneva. Worse than poverty was the poisonous atmosphere among exiles. Russian revolutionaries crammed into the same Swiss and French cities, nursing grudges in cheap cafes, fighting over ideological nuances while the Tsar's regime stabilized. Every faction published its own newspaper, each claiming to represent true social democracy. The energy that should have gone into revolution dissipated in what Lenin bitterly called émigré squabbles, skloki. The Mensheviks advocated liquidating the underground party entirely, working legally in whatever spaces the regime permitted. Trade unions, cooperatives, the castrated parliament called the Duma. Lenin raged against liquidationism, but faced his own dilemmas. Should Bolsheviks participate in the Duma elections? Use legal organizations? The old formulas from What Is to Be Done? I didn't answer these questions. Money became desperately short. Party dues from Russia dried up as organizations collapsed. Lenin survived on his mother's diminishing support and meager fees from articles. Then came the expropriation controversy. Bolshevik fighting squads in the Caucasus, led by a young Georgian called Koba, later Stalin, robbed banks to fund the party. The Tiflis heist of 1907 netted hundreds of thousands of rubles, but also a storm of condemnation. Mensheviks denounced the robberies as criminality masquerading as revolution. European socialists were appalled. This wasn't how civilized Marxists behaved. Even some Bolsheviks questioned whether bank robbery advanced the cause. Lenin defended the expropriations publicly, while privately worrying about their corrupting effects. Revolution required money, but at what moral cost? Personal life offered little comfort. Krupskaya developed thyroid disease, her eyes bulging more prominently, her health deteriorating in the damp exile cities. Lenin's headaches worsened, sometimes confining him to darkened rooms for days. Their marriage, never passionate, settled into routine partnership. Then Inessa Armand arrived, and everything changed. She appeared at a Bolshevik meeting in Paris in 1909, 35 years old, beautiful, brilliant, fluent in 5 languages. A feminist who'd abandoned her bourgeois husband for revolution. She attached herself to Lenin's faction with an intensity that went beyond politics. Soon she was translating his articles, organizing his correspondence, brightening exile life with her vivacity. Whether they became lovers remains disputed. Krupskaya maintained dignified silence then and later, but something in Lenin softened around Inessa. The iron revolutionary who subordinated everything to politics suddenly took long walks in the Bois de Boulogne, attended concerts, discussed French poetry. For perhaps the only time in his adult life, Vladimir Ulyanov allowed himself something approaching happiness. But politics remained primary. By 1912, Lenin decided on a final split with the Mensheviks. At a conference in Prague, barely 18 delegates attending, he declared his faction the only legitimate Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. The Mensheviks were expelled. The Bolsheviks became not a faction but the party itself. It was audacious, arguably illegitimate, classically Lenin. The Prague conference also revealed a new problem. The Okhrana hadn't been idle during the reaction years. They'd infiltrated every revolutionary organization, placing agents at the highest levels. Roman Malinovsky, elected to the Bolshevik Central Committee at Prague, was simultaneously drawing a police salary. Lenin's most trusted lieutenant in Russia was a police spy. Suspicions about Malinovsky circulated for years. His miraculous escapes from arrest, the precision of police raids after his visits, his provocative speeches that gave authorities excuses for crackdowns. But Lenin refused to believe it. Malinovsky was too valuable. A Bolshevik deputy in the Duma, a link to Russian workers, proof the party still functioned. To admit he was a spy meant admitting Lenin's judgment had catastrophically failed. The years 1912 to 1914 brought unexpected revival. Russian workers, recovering from defeat, began striking again. The Lena Goldfield massacre of 1912, where troops killed hundreds of striking miners, triggered nationwide protests. Bolshevik organizations revived, their uncompromising message attracting workers tired of liberal promises. And Menshevik moderation? Lenin moved to Krakow in Austrian Poland, closer to Russia. From there he could receive visitors, send instructions, feel the pulse of reviving struggle. The party newspaper Pravda, Truth, began publishing legally in Petersburg, circumventing censorship through careful language while spreading Bolshevik ideas. Circulation grew to 40,000, reaching factories across the empire. He was deep in theoretical work. During the war years, particularly around 1916 while in Zurich, he would write, "Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism," explaining how colonial super-profits allowed capitalists to bribe labor aristocracies with reforms, thus postponing European revolution. But imperialism also created new contradictions, wars between capitalist powers, revolutionary movements in colonies. The chain would break at its weakest link. By summer 1914, Lenin felt cautiously optimistic. The Bolsheviks had 6 deputies in the Duma, dozens of agents in major factories, a legal newspaper reaching thousands daily. The European socialist movement seemed powerful. Millions of members pledged to prevent war through general strikes. History was moving again, slowly but perceptibly. Then came August. Archduke Ferdinand's assassination triggered declarations of war across Europe. The same socialist parties that had pledged international solidarity voted for war credits, sent workers to die for their national capitalists. The Second International collapsed overnight. Everything Lenin thought he knew about European socialism proved false. He was in Galicia when war broke out, nearly arrested as a Russian spy, before socialist contacts vouched for him. The journey to neutral Switzerland was a week-long train trip through a Europe gone mad with patriotic fever. Arriving in Bern, he found the exile community shattered. Some socialists supported their governments. Others maintained pacifist opposition. Lenin developed a third position, revolutionary defeatism. turn imperialist war into civil war. It was his loneliest hour. Even Bolsheviks found his position extreme. Advocate defeat of your own government during wartime? Use the crisis for revolution regardless of consequences? Plekhanov called him insane. Martov labeled him a German agent. European socialists wouldn't even publish his articles. But Lenin had learned to trust his analysis over popular opinion. Imperialism made war inevitable. War created revolutionary situations. Those who compromised with patriotism betrayed socialism. Better to stand alone with correct principles than join the social chauvinist chorus. History would vindicate him or make his opinions irrelevant. In a Zurich library, while millions died in trenches, Lenin studied Hegel's dialectics, preparing for opportunities he couldn't yet see. The European socialist movement lay in ruins. The Bolshevik organization barely functioned. He was 45 years old, exhausted, isolated, leading a party that existed mostly in his own stubborn faith. But somewhere in the carnage, new possibilities were stirring. The old world was dying. Perhaps, just perhaps, a new one could be born. Chapter 11. The Guns of August. The Collapse of an Ideal. August 4th, 1914. Lenin sat in a Peronin cafe, reading the Neue Freie Press with growing disbelief. The German Social Democrats, 4 million strong theoretical heirs of Marx and Engels, had voted unanimously for war credits. French socialists did the same. British Labour fell in line. The Second International, monument to working-class solidarity, collapsed like a house built on sand. His first reaction was denial. The newspaper must be lying, spreading bourgeois propaganda. Surely Kautsky, the Pope of Marxism, hadn't blessed workers killing workers for imperial glory. But confirmation arrived with each post. Socialist leaders across Europe wrapped themselves in national flags, explaining why this war was different, defensive, justified. The betrayal was total. Local police arrived at his lodgings. As a Russian subject in Austrian territory, he was technically an enemy alien. They searched his rooms, confusing his notes on agrarian statistics for military codes. Only intervention by Austrian socialists, who assured authorities this strange Russian spent his time attacking the Tsar, not serving him, saved Lenin from a longer imprisonment, though he was arrested and jailed for a period in August. The journey to Switzerland was a week-long train trip through a Europe transformed. Train stations swarmed with soldiers heading to fronts that didn't exist yet. Citizens who'd been internationalists last month now howled for enemy blood. In Vienna, Lenin stopped to thank Austrian socialist Victor Adler for his help. Reaching Bern, he found the exile community in chaos. Some Russian social democrats supported the Entente, arguing German militarism threatened democracy. Others backed the Central Powers, claiming Russian autocracy was socialism's main enemy. Most retreated into pacifism, mouthing platitudes about peace while workers died by thousands daily. Lenin found all positions contemptible. He developed his own analysis with characteristic ruthlessness. The war wasn't an accident or diplomatic failure, but imperialism's logical outcome. Capitalist powers had divided the world. Now they fought to re-divide it. Socialist leaders who supported their governments were social chauvinists, traitors who'd exchanged principles for ministerial portfolios and parliamentary comfort. The correct position was revolutionary defeatism. Workers should desire their own government's defeat, use the crisis to overthrow their own bourgeoisie, turn imperialist war into civil war. When Martov protested this meant millions more deaths, Lenin replied coldly, "The question is not how many die, but for what they die. Better civil war for socialism than imperialist war for capital." His fury focused on Karl Kautsky, once his theoretical guide. Kautsky's sophisticated justifications for German social democracy's betrayal, the need to defend culture against Tsarist barbarism, the tactical necessity of temporary compromise, enraged Lenin more than crude patriotism. Here was Marxism prostituted, theory twisted to justify cowardice. He wrote frantically that autumn articles that Swiss publishers refused to print. The collapse of the Second International dissected each socialist party's betrayal with surgical precision. French socialists had forgotten the Commune. Germans had traded Marx for the Kaiser. The entire edifice of European socialism, built over decades, had crumbled at capital's first serious test. But collapse created opportunity. If the old international was dead, a new one could be born, smaller, harder, purged of opportunist infection. Not a debating society, but a general staff for world revolution. The war had torn away democratic illusions, revealed capitalism's barbaric essence. Now workers would learn through blood what propaganda couldn't teach. Inessa Armand joined him in Switzerland, helping organize what remained of the Bolshevik emigration. Together they planned a conference of anti-war socialists, reaching out to every group that hadn't succumbed to patriotic fever. The responses were meager: a handful of Germans, some Italian youth, scattered individuals from neutral countries. But Lenin had learned that history rewards minorities who hold correct positions. Money was desperately short. His mother had died in 1916, cutting off family support. Party funds from Russia barely trickled through wartime borders. Lenin and Krupskaya moved to cheaper lodgings, ate in workers' cafeterias, donned clothes until they fell apart. The future ruler of Russia owned 2 suits, both shiny with wear. Yet poverty sharpened his focus. While other exiles despaired, Lenin studied the war's economic impact, military technology, colonial rebellions. Every development confirmed his analysis. Imperialism was capitalism's final stage, pregnant with its own destruction. The question was whether revolutionaries would serve as midwives or let the opportunity miscarry. Personal relationships strained under exile's pressure. Krupskaya's health worsened. Her relationship with Lenin had evolved into comradeship without warmth, revolutionary partnership without personal intimacy. She knew about Inessa, said nothing, continued managing his correspondence and manuscripts with meticulous care. Inessa herself struggled with their impossible situation. Lenin needed her, as translator, organizer, perhaps the only person who could make him laugh. But he would never leave Krupskaya, never place personal happiness above revolutionary duty. Inessa accepted these limits while slowly breaking inside. Revolution demanded everything, gave little back. By 1915, the war had settled into mechanized slaughter. Millions died for gains measured in meters. The same workers who'd marched to war singing now rotted in trenches, learning Lenin's lessons about imperialism through poison gas and machine guns. But would this education translate into revolutionary consciousness? He placed his hopes on Russia, imperialism's weakest link. The Tsarist military machine, impressive on parade grounds, was crumbling under modern war's demands. Defeats mounted. Casualties soared. Food shortages spread from cities to countryside. Each disaster weakened autocracy's foundations, created cracks through which revolution might emerge. Reports from Bolsheviks inside Russia were fragmentary but encouraging. The party organization, shattered by arrests and infiltration, was slowly rebuilding. Workers who'd supported the war initially now struck against munitions factories. Soldiers grumbled about incompetent officers and missing supplies. Even peasants, normally monarchist, questioned a Tsar who couldn't organize victory. Lenin adjusted his tactics to wartime conditions. The old slogan, democratic dictatorship of proletariat and peasantry, no longer sufficed. He developed new formulations, defeat into revolution, imperialist war into civil war, Russian Revolution a spark for European conflagration. Each phrase was calibrated to transform despair into action. Yet doubt crept in during sleepless nights. He was 46, exhausted by decades of struggle. His theoretical victories meant nothing if they remained theoretical. Would he die in Swiss exile? Another revolutionary fossil preserved in Central European amber? Sometimes he envied his brother's clarity. Better to die young for something than grow old believing in nothing. The war ground on through 1916. Each month brought new horrors. Verdun, the Somme, Brusilov's offensive. Each battle confirmed imperialism's bankruptcy while seeming to strengthen its grip. Lenin wrote, organized, waited, but history moved at its own pace. Revolution required objective conditions and subjective readiness. The conditions were ripening, but where were the revolutionaries? Even as he acknowledged the grave-like stillness in Europe, he saw Russia's revolution as on the march. He couldn't know that in Petersburg, renamed Petrograd in patriotic fever, women textile workers were planning a strike for International Women's Day, that bread shortages would bring them into streets, that their march would trigger mutinies, topple a dynasty, open possibilities beyond his wildest calculations. The future was preparing its surprises while Lenin sat in Zurich, theorizing about a revolution he feared he'd never see. Chapter 12. Zimmerwald's Cry, Zurich's Quiet. September 5, 1915. Socialists gathered in Zimmerwald, a Swiss village chosen for its isolation. They arrived separately, pretending to be tourists carrying rucksacks instead of revolutionary manifestos. The entire anti-war socialist movement of Europe fit in 4 carriages. Lenin joked bitterly that internationalism could now hold its meetings in a cottage. But small numbers meant clarity of purpose. Here were the ones who hadn't bent. Italian youth who'd split from their patriotic party. Germans risking prison for anti-war agitation. Poles and Serbs who refused to choose between competing imperialisms. They looked exhausted, undernourished, prematurely aged by swimming against history's current, Lenin saw future cadres. The conference split immediately. The majority wanted a pacifist manifesto: stop the war, restore international brotherhood, return to pre-war socialism. Lenin's faction demanded more: turn imperialist war into civil war, split from social chauvinists permanently, build new revolutionary international. The arguments raged through Alpine nights while Europe bled. Trotsky attended, still trying to reconcile irreconcilable positions. He crafted compromise, language that satisfied no one completely, but allowed common action. The Zimmerwald manifesto condemned the war without endorsing revolution, called for peace without specifying how to achieve it. Lenin signed, while privately calling it toothless. Better weak internationalism than none at all. The Zimmerwald left. Lenin's faction within a faction met separately. A small group of delegates, the embryo of future Communist International. They drafted their own statement, clear as mountain water: no peace with capitalism, no unity with traitors, no retreat from revolutionary principles. History would judge who was correct. Returning to Zurich, Lenin threw himself into theoretical work. If revolution was coming, it needed scientific guidance. He devoured books on economics, philosophy, military science. His notebooks, filled with excerpts from Clausewitz on war, Hegel on dialectics, statistics on colonial exploitation, each fact was ammunition for battles ahead. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, emerged from this study in 1916. Lenin's synthesis was devastating. Capitalism's final stage meant monopoly, finance capital, colonial division, inevitable war. No reforms could fix it. Revolution wasn't idealistic dreaming, but historical necessity. The book explained why European workers hadn't revolted as Marx predicted. Colonial super profits allowed capitalists to bribe labor aristocracies with crumbs from imperial feasts. But this solution created new problems: colonial revolts, inter-imperial wars, revolutionary situations in weakest links. Capitalism postponed its crisis by globalizing it. Daily life in Zurich settled into monastic routine. Morning study in the library, afternoon correspondence with scattered Bolsheviks, evening meetings with whoever hadn't given up. Lenin lived like a graduate student: shabby clothes, cheap lodgings, meals of bread and tea. The future chairman of the world's first socialist state owned nothing but books and conviction. Krupskaya managed their poverty with grim efficiency. She pawned her last jewelry, mended clothes until thread wouldn't hold, cooked meals from scraps. Her health deteriorated, thyroid disease advancing, heart weakening, but she never complained. Revolution had consumed her youth, middle age, health. She had nothing left to give, but continued giving. Inessa lived nearby. She translated Lenin's articles, organized women socialists, and was a trusted confidant. Sometimes the three would walk together, Lenin explaining theoretical points, Krupskaya taking notes, Inessa adding insights. Observers saw dedicated revolutionaries. News from Russia arrived sporadically. The Bolshevik Duma deputies, arrested for anti-war agitation, were tried and exiled. Pravda was suppressed, reappeared under new names, suppressed again. Party organizations survived through cellular structure Lenin had designed, but barely. Each police raid, each arrest, each betrayal weakened networks built over decades. Yet reports also brought hope. Strike statistics climbed despite wartime repression. Soldiers' letters spoke of growing hatred for officers who spent lives like kopecks. Food shortages in cities created explosive combinations, workers with nothing to lose, weapons from munitions factories, consciousness sharpened by suffering. The objective conditions Lenin analyzed were ripening. The anti-war socialist movement continued to meet, but divisions persisted. New delegates wanted respectability, parliamentary action, gradual pressure for peace. Lenin's revolutionary position remained minoritarian, even among minorities. He fought every compromise with exhausting intensity. When moderates proposed appealing to belligerent governments, Lenin erupted. Might as well petition wolves to become vegetarian. When pacifists preached abstract humanity, he countered with class analysis. Peace without revolution meant preparation for next war. Only proletarian power could end imperialist slaughter permanently. The debates revealed fundamental divisions about socialism's meaning. For most delegates, it meant better wages, democratic rights, gradual progress. For Lenin, it meant dictatorship of proletariat, expropriation of expropriators, worldwide revolution. The gap couldn't be bridged by clever resolutions. Two souls inhabited socialism's body, and divorce was inevitable. Back in Zurich, he prepared for split by building networks. Young Swiss socialists, radicalized by war, gathered around him. Fritz Platten, who would later play a role in his return to Russia, was among those influenced by Lenin's ideas. He taught like he wrote, sharp, clear, merciless toward confusion. Students emerged, either converted or repelled. By winter 1916, exhaustion was visible. Lenin's hair had thinned to wisps. His suits hung on a frame worn down by decades of irregular meals and constant tension. Headaches confined him to darkened rooms for days. At 46, he looked 60, moved like an old man, sustained only by will and caffeine. In January 1917, speaking to Swiss workers, he acknowledged that the older generation might not see the decisive battles of the coming European revolution, even as he affirmed that Europe was pregnant with it. He saw the Russian Revolution, however, as very much on the march. 6 weeks later, revolution exploded in Petrograd. Women textile workers, demanding bread, triggered events that toppled a 300-year dynasty in 8 days. History, apparently, hadn't read Lenin's timetable. While he theorized in Zurich, Russian masses made revolution without permission, creating possibilities beyond any exile's imagination. The news arrived, garbled, incredible. The Tsar abdicated, Soviets reborn, provisional government proclaiming democracy. Lenin paced his tiny apartment like a caged animal, desperate for reliable information. Everything he'd worked for was happening without him, 4,000 kilometers away, behind enemy lines. Revolution had come, but how to reach it? He began planning immediately. Legal routes were impossible. No Allied government would transport a revolutionary defeatist. But where legal channels failed, perhaps illegal ones might succeed. The German General Staff, eager to weaken Russia, might facilitate passage for exiles who preached revolution. It meant dealing with devils, but Lenin had learned that history cared nothing for clean hands. Chapter 13. The Sealed Train to Destiny. March 15th, 1917. Lenin burst into the library where Krupskaya was reading, waving a Swiss newspaper. "It's happened," he shouted, disturbing scholarly silence. "The Tsar has abdicated." Other readers glared, but Lenin didn't care. Revolution had come to Russia while he sat in Zurich, marooned by geography and war. The first reports were fragmentary, contradictory. Women's protests had triggered military mutinies. The Duma had formed a provisional government. Soviets were organizing in factories. The Tsar was arrested, or fled, or dead. Nobody knew. But one fact emerged clearly. 3 centuries of Romanov rule had ended in less than a week. History had accelerated beyond theory's ability to follow. Lenin's mind raced through implications. A bourgeois government would seek stability, continue the war, postpone social revolution. The Soviets, if dominated by Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, would support this democratic stage. His Bolsheviks, leaderless and confused, might be swept along by patriotic euphoria. Every day he remained in Switzerland meant opportunities lost, mistakes uncorrected. He fired off telegrams to Petrograd. No compromise with provisional government, no support for imperialist war, arm the workers, all power to Soviets. But did they arrive? Were they heeded? Communication through wartime borders was like shouting into a storm. He needed to return immediately. But how? Every route seemed blocked by armies, borders, hostile governments. Desperate schemes multiplied. Forge Swedish passports? Too risky. His face was known to police across Europe. Fly over Germany in an airplane? Technically impossible and suicidal? Hide in a freight car? The journey would take weeks, if successful at all. Each plan collapsed under practical examination while precious time hemorrhaged away. Then came the devil's bargain. Swiss socialists, including Fritz Platten, acted as intermediaries with German authorities. The German General Staff, fighting a 2-front war, desperately wanted Russia neutralized. Revolutionary exiles preaching defeatism might accomplish what German armies couldn't. Would Lenin accept German assistance to reach Russia? The moral implications were staggering. Accepting German help meant providing ammunition to enemies who'd call him a German agent forever. It meant collaborating with imperialists he'd spent years denouncing. It meant choosing revolutionary necessity over revolutionary purity. Lenin didn't hesitate. "The question is not who uses whom," he told wavering comrades. "The question is reaching Russia before the revolution is strangled." Negotiations proceeded through Swiss intermediaries. The Germans agreed to transport a sealed train through their territory. No inspections, no contact with German authorities, extraterritorial status like a moving embassy. In return, the exiles would, it was understood by the Germans, contribute to Russia's instability and desire for peace. Each side thought it was using the other. History would judge who used whom more effectively. The exile community exploded in controversy. Martov denounced the plan as treason. Plekhanov called Lenin a German spy. Even some Bolsheviks hesitated. How could they explain accepting enemy assistance? Lenin responded with typical brutality. I would make a deal with the devil himself if it would help the revolution. Those who prefer clean hands to revolutionary victory should join a monastery, not a political party. On April 9th, 1917, about 30 exiles, including Lenin, Krupskaya, and Inessa Armand, gathered at Zurich station. They carried minimal luggage, maximum hope. Lenin had spent the previous night destroying papers, settling accounts, preparing for a journey from which he might not return. Revolution meant burning bridges, sometimes literally. The train was indeed sealed. Chalk lines on the floor marked boundaries no one could cross. German guards rode in separate compartments, forbidden to interact with passengers. The exiles organized themselves with Soviet precision. Smoking restricted to the vestibule, toilet use by schedule, political discussions after meals. Even traveling to revolution, Lenin insisted on discipline. Through Germany they rolled, across a landscape devastated by war. Empty fields, destroyed villages, military trains heading to slaughter. Lenin barely looked out windows, having drafted key ideas for his April thesis before departure. His fellow passengers expected him to support the provisional government temporarily, as orthodox Marxism demanded. They didn't know he was preparing to dynamite orthodoxy. At night, unable to sleep, he paced the narrow corridor, mind churning through scenarios. What if the provisional government had consolidated power? What if Bolsheviks had merged with Mensheviks? What if the Soviets were already tamed? 3 years of war had changed Russia profoundly. His analyses might be obsolete, his party evaporated, his return irrelevant. They reached the Baltic coast at Sassnitz, transferred to a Swedish ferry. The sealed train had served its purpose, delivering revolutionaries through enemy territory without political contamination. Now came Scandinavia, neutral but nervous, watching the Russian chaos with anxiety. Swedish socialists met them, provided food and shelter, wondered if these shabby Russians really intended to overthrow capitalism. Through Sweden by train, crowds of curious workers gathering at stations. Lenin gave brief speeches. Revolution in Russia was prologue to revolution everywhere. Imperialism's chain was breaking. Prepare for your own moment. The Swedish authorities, alarmed by his rhetoric, hurried the group toward Finland, glad to make them someone else's problem. Finland still technically belonged to Russia but enjoyed autonomy. Here, Lenin felt liberation approaching. The landscape grew familiar. Birch forests, wooden villages, Orthodox church domes. Russian voices replaced Germanic gutturals. Even the train wheels seemed to chant, "Closer, closer, closer to revolution, closer to destiny, closer to home." They reached the Finnish-Russian border. No impediments now. The provisional government, proclaiming democratic freedoms, couldn't prevent political exiles from returning. As they crossed into Russia, someone began singing the Internationale. Others joined, voices growing stronger as Mother Russia embraced her prodigal children. Lenin remained silent, calculating. The journey's last leg to Petrograd passed in mounting excitement. At every station, workers and soldiers gathered, hungry for news, for leadership, for someone to explain what their revolution meant. Lenin watched from his window. The masses were armed, organized, expectant. But expectant of what? Democratic republic? Socialist revolution? The answer would determine everything. They approached Petrograd as night fell on April 3rd, old style. Lenin had been traveling for 8 days, awake for most of them, sustained by nervous energy and iron will. In hours he would face comrades who'd made revolution without him, would propose a program none expected, would split his own party if necessary. The sealed train had delivered him to history's threshold. Now he had to cross it. Krupskaya watched him stare into darkness as Petrograd's lights appeared. 17 years of exile were ending. The boy from Simbirsk, who'd vowed to find another way than his brother's noose, had found it, or thought he had. Revolution was no longer theory, but fact. No longer future, but present. Everything he'd prepared for was about to be tested. As the train slowed for Finland Station, Vladimir Ulyanov ceased to exist. Lenin was coming home. Chapter 14. Riding the Whirlwind. Finland Station, April 3rd, 1917, 11:10 at night. Lenin stepped onto the platform into a scene from fever dreams. Searchlights blazed. Red banners fluttered. Thousands of workers, soldiers, sailors packed the square outside, singing revolutionary songs. Inside the station, dignitaries from the Petrograd Soviet waited with official greetings, prepared speeches about democratic unity, revolutionary defensism, the long road ahead. They never got to deliver them. Lenin, ignoring the bouquet thrust at him, climbed onto an armored car and delivered his own message. The provisional government was bourgeois deception. The imperialist war must end immediately. Land to the peasants, factories to workers, all power to the Soviets. Not someday, not after patient preparation, but now. The crowd roared approval while Soviet leaders stood slack-jawed. At Bolshevik headquarters in the Shasinskaya mansion, a ballerina's palace turned revolutionary fortress, Lenin repeated his program to party leaders. They listened in mounting horror. Support the provisional government? Never. Unite with Mensheviks? Betrayal. Continue the war defensively? Social chauvinism. Everything they'd agreed while he was gone, he demolished in 10 minutes of Arctic clarity. Kamenev, who'd led the party in Lenin's absence, tried to argue Russia wasn't ready for socialist revolution. The bourgeoisie hadn't completed its historical tasks. Workers were a minority. Peasants wanted only land, not socialism. Marx himself had written, Lenin cut him off. Marx wrote for different conditions. We have Soviets, dual power, armed masses. History offers a chance that won't repeat. Seize it or perish. The next day, Lenin presented his April theses to a gathering of social democrats. The reaction was explosive. Plekhanov called them ravings of a madman. Former allies accused him of anarchism, blanquism, betraying Marxism itself. Even Pravda, the Bolshevik newspaper, published them with editorial disclaimers. Lenin stood alone, as he had so often, waiting for others to catch up. But in factories and barracks, workers and soldiers read the theses differently. Here was someone saying what they felt. The February Revolution was unfinished. The provisional government protected landlords and capitalists. The war enriched profiteers, while common people died. Simple slogans crystallized complex feelings. Peace, land, bread, all power to the Soviets. Clear, concrete, uncompromising. Within weeks, Lenin had won over the Bolshevik Party through sheer persistence. Meeting after meeting, he hammered his points home. The bourgeois revolution was complete. Now came proletarian revolution. Soviets were embryonic workers' state. Dual power couldn't last. Either Soviets would triumph or reaction would crush them. No middle ground existed. Events accelerated his arguments. The provisional government, trying to satisfy everyone, satisfied no one. Minister of War, Kerensky, yes, the son of Lenin's old gymnasium director, launched a new offensive that collapsed in blood and chaos. Soldiers deserted en masse. Workers struck against factories still producing for war. Peasants seized estates without waiting for legal reform. July brought crisis. Soldiers from the Kronstadt naval base, sailors and workers staged armed demonstrations demanding Soviet power. The Bolsheviks hadn't organized it. Lenin thought it premature, but couldn't abandon masses in motion. They tried directing the flood, while knowing it would ebb. After 3 days of chaos, government forces restored order. Now came repression. "Lenin is a German agent," screamed headlines publishing documents, some forged, some real, about the sealed train. Warrants were issued for Bolshevik leaders. Red Guards were disarmed. The Kshezinskaya mansion was stormed. Lenin, after fierce internal debate, went into hiding. Better to live underground than die uselessly. Revolution needed living leaders, not martyrs. He spent August and September in various hideouts. A worker's apartment in Petrograd, a hayloft in Razliv, finally a flat in Helsinki. Disguised with a wig and clean-shaven for the only time in his adult life, he looked like a Finnish peasant, but his pen remained sharp. He worked on State and Revolution, a book based on reading done before the revolution, which outlined the future socialist state with chilling precision and would be published in 1918. From underground, he bombarded the Central Committee with increasingly frantic letters. Kerensky's government was disintegrating. General Kornilov had attempted a military coup, defeated only because Bolsheviks organized workers' resistance. The masses were radicalizing daily. Soviets in major cities had Bolshevik majorities. History's moment had arrived. Strike now or lose everything. But the Central Committee hesitated. Kamenev and Zinoviev argued for patience. Let the Constituent Assembly meet, gain power legally. Others worried about isolation, premature action, insufficient support. Lenin's letters grew savage. History will not forgive revolutionaries who could win today, but risk losing tomorrow. Delay is death. October 10th, Lenin returned to Petrograd secretly for a Central Committee meeting in an apartment belonging to Sukhanov, a Menshevik whose wife was secretly Bolshevik. 12 leaders debated while Lenin, still wigged and beardless, pounded the table. The vote was 10-2 for insurrection. Kamenev and Zinoviev, opposing, would soon publicly reveal the decision, nearly sabotaging everything. The insurrection was planned for October 25th, when the Second Congress of Soviets would meet. Not a coup, but a transfer of power from discredited government to legitimate Soviet authority. Trotsky, now Bolshevik and heading the Military Revolutionary Committee, organized brilliantly. Key points were identified: bridges, telegraph stations, power plants. Red Guards were armed and instructed. On the night of October 24th, Lenin could wait no longer. Against Central Committee orders, he left his hiding place and walked through darkened streets to Smolny Institute, Soviet headquarters. Challenged by patrols, he claimed to be a drunk worker. Reaching Smolny, he found organized chaos. Messengers racing, telephones ringing, but action progressing too slowly for his taste. "You are procrastinating," he roared at startled commanders. The Winter Palace, where ministers huddled, should be taken immediately. Every moment's delay gave reaction time to organize. By dawn on the 25th, most strategic points were secured with minimal bloodshed. Kerensky fled in a borrowed car. Other ministers waited arrest in the Winter Palace, defended by cadets and a women's battalion. That evening, as the palace fell to a shambolic assault, more comic than heroic, Lenin addressed the Soviet Congress. "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order," he announced, as if discussing tomorrow's weather. Mensheviks and right socialist revolutionaries walked out in protest. Trotsky sent them to history's dustbin. Power had passed to the Soviets, meaning to the Bolsheviks who controlled them. The first decrees revealed Lenin's tactical genius. The decree on peace proposed immediate negotiations, appealing over governments' heads to war-exhausted peoples. The decree on land gave peasants what they'd already taken, legitimizing seizures while establishing Soviet authority. Simple popular measures that consolidated support while enemies organized resistance. Within weeks, challenges multiplied. State employees struck. Banks refused funds. The Constituent Assembly, elected before October, had an anti-Bolshevik majority. Officers were forming white armies. Foreign powers prepared intervention. Every Marxist text said socialist revolution required developed capitalism, which Russia lacked. Reality mocked theory daily. Lenin adapted with brutal flexibility. The Constituent Assembly was dispersed after one day. Revolutionary dictatorship is power won by force and unrestricted by any laws. Banks were occupied. Striking bureaucrats were replaced by workers who learned administration through practice. When left socialist revolutionaries quit the government over peace terms, Bolsheviks ruled alone. By March 1918, when the government fled to Moscow as Germans advanced, Lenin had kept power for 5 months, longer than the Paris Commune, his only precedent. The Brest-Litovsk peace treaty cost huge territories but bought time. Civil war was beginning, but Reds held the center, while Whites remained scattered. Against all probability, the October gamble was paying off. Yet Lenin knew this was only the beginning. Russian Revolution without European revolution meant socialism in a backward country, a contradiction Marx never imagined. Every temporary measure, terror, one-party rule, economic centralization risked becoming permanent. The whirlwind he'd ridden to power might destroy what it had created. But no retreat was possible now. History would judge results, not intentions. Chapter 15. Beyond the textbook, into silence. The Civil War years turned Lenin from revolutionary into ruler, theorist into practitioner of power. From his Kremlin office, he directed simultaneous battles against white armies, foreign interventions, peasant rebellions, economic collapse, and the stubborn refusal of European workers to follow Russia's example. Each crisis demanded decisions no Marxist text had anticipated. War communism emerged from desperation disguised as doctrine. Grain requisitioning fed cities and armies while alienating peasants. Industry was nationalized not from socialist principle, but because owners fled or sabotaged production. Money became worthless paper. Distribution replaced markets. Lenin justified each measure as revolutionary necessity, while privately acknowledging they were improvising survival. The Cheka, political police led by Iron Felix Dzerzhinsky, evolved from defending revolution to devouring suspected enemies. "We aren't waging war against individuals," Dzerzhinsky explained. "We're exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class." The logic was impeccable, the results horrifying. Each white atrocity justified red terror. Each red excess provoked white retaliation. Violence spiraled beyond anyone's control. Lenin authorized executions with the same precision he'd once analyzed statistics. When Fanny Kaplan, a socialist revolutionary, shot him in August 1918, leaving bullets that would slowly poison him, he refused personal revenge but approved systematic retaliation. Hundreds of class enemies died for one woman's act. Revolutionary mathematics counted lives differently than bourgeois morality. Yet he could still surprise, with flashes of the old theoretical subtlety. When communist parties formed across Europe, Lenin wrote, "Left-wing communism, an infantile disorder," in 1920, warning against revolutionary romanticism, boycotting parliaments, refusing compromises, expecting instant revolution. These were children's games. Real politics meant maneuvering, retreating, exploiting every legal possibility while building illegal strength. By 1920, the whites were defeated, foreign interventions had failed, but victory's price was catastrophic. Industry produced 1/7 of 1913 levels. Cities emptied as workers fled to villages seeking food. The proletariat in whose name Bolsheviks ruled had nearly disappeared. Peasants, having seized land, wanted nothing from communists but to be left alone. Then came Kronstadt. The same sailors who'd been Bolshevism's vanguard rebelled in March 1921, demanding free Soviets, end to Bolshevik monopoly, restoration of revolutionary democracy. Lenin ordered assault across the ice, personally selecting reliable troops. Thousands died attacking former comrades. Afterward, he looked aged beyond his 50 years. "We've gone too far," he admitted privately, announcing the new economic policy at the 10th Party Congress. NEP restored limited capitalism. Peasants could trade freely. Small businesses operate privately. Foreign concessions were welcomed. Party diehards screamed betrayal. Lenin replied that sometimes retreat enabled future advance. Socialism couldn't be built through willpower alone. But even while retreating economically, he tightened political control. The same Congress that approved NEP banned factions within the party. Democracy, already strangled in society, died within Bolshevism itself. The logic was familiar: temporary measures during crisis. Yet each temporary measure seemed to become permanent. Each exception evolved into rule. His health deteriorated through 1921. Headaches became blinding. Insomnia alternated with exhaustion. Doctors prescribed rest. Lenin prescribed himself more work. There was so much to build. Electrification plans, educational campaigns, diplomatic openings. Soviet Russia had survived, but remained isolated, backward, vulnerable. Everything depended on his driving will. May 1922 brought the first stroke. His right side partially paralyzed, speech slurred. Recovery seemed possible until December's second stroke left him unable to write. The man who'd lived through words was trapped in failing flesh. Secretaries took dictation, but thoughts that had flowed like water now came in painful drops. His last writings showed unexpected doubts. The bureaucracy he'd created to implement revolution was suffocating it. Stalin, appointed General Secretary to handle administrative tasks, was accumulating dangerous power. The party ruled in workers' name, but workers had no voice. Revolution had succeeded and failed simultaneously. Power was won, but socialism remained distant. Testament, dictated in December 1922, warned against Stalin's rudeness, Trotsky's arrogance, the danger of splits. But who would heed warnings from a dying man? The struggle for succession was already beginning. Old Bolsheviks who'd followed Lenin through exile and underground maneuvered for position while he lay paralyzed, watching his life's work mutate. March 1923 brought the third stroke, stealing speech entirely. The voice that had commanded revolution was silenced. He could only gesture, his eyes showing either understanding or confusion. Visitors couldn't tell which. Krupskaya read to him, pretending he comprehended. Sometimes he seemed to nod. More often he stared at nothing. Through spring and summer he lingered, neither improving nor quite dying. The party leadership visited dutifully, briefing him on developments he couldn't influence. NEP was succeeding economically, but creating new bourgeoisie. Party membership swelled with careerists. The Comintern, supposed to spread revolution, was becoming Soviet foreign policy tool. Everything was wrong, but nothing could be changed. His last months were spent at Gorky Estate outside Moscow, surrounded by doctors, guards, and crushing silence. The man who'd given his life to history was removed from it, watching through windows as seasons changed. Did he think of Simbirsk, of his brother's noose, of Swiss exile, of October's triumph? No one knows. His thoughts died with him. January 21, 1924, 6:50 in the evening. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Lenin, stopped breathing. He was 53 years old, had ruled for 6 years, changed the world forever. The brain that autopsy revealed showed massive damage. Revolution had literally burned out his circuits. He'd driven himself like a machine until the machine broke. They embalmed him against his wishes, built a mausoleum he would have hated, turned the fierce iconoclast into icon. Stalin spoke at the funeral, pledging to guard Lenin's legacy while preparing to betray it. Trotsky, conveniently absent, would spend his remaining years claiming Lenin's mantle while missing Lenin's tactical genius. What remained was a transformed world. An empire had fallen, replaced by something unprecedented, a state claiming to rule for workers, spreading revolution like religion. Capitalism would never again sleep soundly. Colonial peoples had seen Europeans could be defeated. History's spiral had taken an irreversible turn. But questions haunted Lenin's legacy. Could socialism be built in one backward country? Did revolutionary ends justify any means? Was the party's dictatorship temporary necessity or permanent defamation? He'd answered with actions, not theories, leaving others to rationalize results. The future would judge harshly but couldn't ignore what he'd achieved, or what achieving it had cost. In the end, he'd found another way than his brother's noose, but perhaps not as different as he'd hoped. Violence, just organized differently. Death, just distributed more widely. The same czarist state, just with new management. Yet also something genuinely new. Proof that history could jump tracks, that impossibilities could become inevitable overnight. The boy from Sibirsk had moved the world. Whether toward paradise or perdition remained an open question. Epilogue, the revolution's echo. Roughly 67 years after Lenin's death, the Soviet Union collapsed like a house of rotten timber. No foreign invasion, no capitalist restoration, just exhaustion. As if the effort of maintaining his impossible dream had finally depleted all reserves. In August 1991, crowds toppled his statues across Eastern Europe, while historians debated what it had all meant. The easy verdict was failure. Socialist paradise had become bureaucratic nightmare. Workers' state had meant party dictatorship. International revolution had produced Russian empire. Every promise had inverted. Equality became hierarchy. Freedom became surveillance. Abundance became shortages. Critics proclaimed history's judgment final. Leninism was a dead end, a prophet's vision that reality rejected. Yet the echo persisted, refusing simple dismissal. In Chinese factories, Vietnamese villages, Cuban hospitals, Lenin's portrait still hung, not the embalmed corpse, but the living revolutionary who'd proved empires could fall. His tactical writings guided movements that had never heard of dialectical materialism. What is to be done? Organized unions in Sao Paulo, guerrillas in Chiapas, protesters in Seattle. More subtly, his ghost haunted the capitalist world that thought it had won. Workers' rights, social welfare, anti-colonial movements, all bore fingerprints of the threat he'd represented. Capitalism reformed itself partially to avoid the fate he'd prescribed. Even in failure, October's revolution had changed what was possible, thinkable, fearable. The man himself remained enigmatic. Was he cynical manipulator or sincere believer? Did power corrupt him or reveal him? Biographers found evidence for every interpretation. The loving son who supported his mother. The cold tactician who betrayed friends. The theorist of liberation who built machinery of oppression. The idealist whose ideals demanded millions of corpses. Perhaps the key lay in that moment by the Volga, when 17-year-old Vladimir learned of his brother's execution. "We will go another way," he'd said, meaning no bombs, no individual terror. But what he'd found wasn't opposite of violence, but its multiplication, systematization, industrialization. The state he'd seized to wither away had grown monstrous. The party meant to express workers' will had replaced it. His last photographs showed a man horror-struck by his creation. Unable to speak, he watched Stalin consolidate power using methods Lenin had pioneered. The testament warning against successors might have been warning against himself. The logic of revolutionary dictatorship leading inevitably to dictators. But by then it was too late. The machine was running on its own momentum. Yet, reducing Lenin to Stalin's precursor missed something essential. However corrupted, he genuinely believed in human liberation. The boy reading Chernyshevsky had dreamed of ending suffering, not inflicting it. The path from dream to nightmare wasn't inevitable but contingent. Choices made under pressure, temporary becoming permanent, means devouring ends. What survived wasn't the Soviet system, but questions it had raised. Could capitalism be transcended? Must inequality be eternal? Was democracy compatible with corporate power? Lenin had answered wrongly but asked correctly. His failure didn't restore the old world, but left it permanently fractured, unable to naturalize its own contradictions. In the 21st century, as inequality soared and democracy hollowed out, his analyses felt newly relevant. Not his solutions, history had tested those, but his recognitions, capitalism's tendency toward crisis, imperialism's connection to war, the gap between formal and actual democracy, insights that outlived the regime that claimed them. His tactical writings, still instructed, stripped of messianic purpose, how to organize, when to advance or retreat, the relationship between spontaneity and consciousness, lessons for anyone seeking change, whether corporate reformer or community organizer. The technology of power he developed proved tragically portable. The embalmed body in Moscow became irrelevant, a tourist curiosity. But the intellectual virus he'd spread, mutated, adapted, survived. In Occupy movements discussing horizontal organization. In theorists analyzing cognitive capitalism. In activists connecting climate crisis to systemic logic. Not Leninism, but questions Leninism had raised, still seeking answers. Perhaps this was history's verdict, neither vindication nor condemnation, but continuation. The conversation he'd forced remained unfinished. The boy from Simbirsk who'd wanted to change everything had succeeded partially, disastrously, permanently. The world couldn't go back to before October 1917, only forward through the ruins and possibilities it had created. His brother Sasha had died, believing in redemptive violence. Vladimir had lived proving violence unredemptive, but sometimes effective. Both had paid prices, one in blood, one in soul. The revolution they'd served in different ways had devoured them both, then continued without them, still hungry, still unfinished. In dreams, perhaps, Lenin still paced that sealed train, calculating futures that would never match calculations, still stood at Finland Station, promising impossibilities that would become inevitable, still lay speechless at Gorky, watching history escape his control. The revolution's echo continued, neither his nor anyone's, bouncing off 21st century walls, waiting for new voices to give it meaning. Some heard promise in that echo. Others heard warning. Most heard only noise. But none could make it stop. The boy who'd vowed to go another way had gone, taking millions with him. Where he'd arrived wasn't where he'd intended. But the journey had transformed the landscape permanently. In that transformation, for better and worse, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov achieved the immortality he'd never sought. History remembered him not as he was, but as what he'd made possible, the dream and nightmare of total transformation, forever linked, forever unfinished.